Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever seen a light where none should exist? It was a cold autumn night, the kind when even the forest seemed to hold its breath. I walked the narrow path, my flashlight barely illuminating the way. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches scratching at the starless sky. My breath fogged in the air, and the crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound accompanying me. That's when I saw it, a faint glow, flickering deep within the trees. It wasn't the steady beam of another flashlight or the cold, static shine of a lantern. No, this was something else. A candle? Out here? Curiosity wrestled with unease as I stepped off the path, moving toward the light. Each step I took seemed louder than the last, the crackle of twigs and leaves breaking the oppressive silence. The glow grew stronger. My heart pounded in time with my steps. The light wasn't just a random flicker anymore, it seemed deliberate, inviting even. But why would anyone light a candle in such a desolate place? The trees thinned, revealing a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of weathered stones, their surfaces etched with marks that the years hadn't managed to erase. The candle burned steadily at the heart of the circle, its tiny flame casting shadows that danced wildly across the stones. For a moment, I hesitated. The air was colder here, heavy and still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place to the night. But something about the circle drew me in, something ancient and unyielding. As I stepped closer, I noticed the faintest trace of a sound, like whispering, too soft to make out the words. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on a breeze I couldn't feel. I crouched by the candle, its warm glow oddly soothing against the chill. The stone nearest to me bore strange carvings, spirals, jagged lines, and symbols I couldn't understand. The whispering grew louder, still incomprehensible, but more urgent now. And then, just as I reached out to touch the stone, the flame flickered violently. A sharp crack split the air, like a branch snapping underfoot, though no one was there. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The darkness around the clearing felt alive, pressing in closer with each passing second. Something was watching me. I stumbled back from the stone, my breath quick and shallow. The candle's flame flared again, its light casting grotesque, twisting shapes onto the surrounding trees. The whispering had stopped, but the forest wasn't silent, it was listening. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam sputtering as if struggling against the oppressive darkness. I turned toward the path I had come from, only to find it gone. The trees had shifted, or perhaps my disorientation made it seem that way. Either way, there was no clear way back. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle, the sound of something moving just beyond the reach of the light. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, deep and impenetrable. "Who's there?" My voice cracked as I called out, the words swallowed by the thick air. No answer. The candle flickered again, brighter this time, as though mocking my fear. The sound came again, closer now, a deliberate step, like someone testing the ground before moving forward. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The clearing felt like a trap, and the shadows outside it felt alive, pulsing with a malevolent intent. The shuffle turned into a rhythmic crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. They circled the clearing, slow and deliberate. My flashlight wavered as I swung it frantically, searching for any sign of movement. Finally, the beam landed on something. A figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. Its form was human, mostly. Tall and thin, it seemed to blend with the shadows, its outline shifting unnaturally. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes, or what I thought were its eyes, reflected the candlelight with a faint, sickly glow. It didn't move. Neither did I. The seconds stretched into eternity. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen, a rabbit caught in the predator's gaze. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if curious, and then stepped forward. The motion broke my paralysis. I turned and bolted, plunging into the forest with no idea where I was going. Branches tore at my clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, I heard the footsteps. They didn't run, they didn't have to. Each step was deliberate, measured, like the slow ticking of a clock. The whispering returned, louder now, filling my ears with an incomprehensible cacophony. It was in the air, in my head, in the ground beneath my feet. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice ragged. The whispering didn't stop. And then I saw it, a faint glimmer through the trees. Another light? No, not just a light. A structure. A small, decrepit cabin, barely visible in the gloom. I didn't think. I just ran toward it, hoping, praying that it might offer some form of safety. The door creaked loudly as I shoved it open and stumbled inside. The interior was as dilapidated as the outside, dusty, with broken furniture scattered across the floor. But it was shelter, and for the moment, that was enough. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, my chest heaving. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Had I lost it? Then, from the corner of the room, a faint glow caught my eye. Another candle. This one was different. Its flame burned higher, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And beside it, etched into the wood of the table, were the same symbols I'd seen on the stones. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I realized the flame wasn't flickering. It was still. And then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door behind me. The knocks echoed through the cabin, each one heavier than the last. My heart hammered in my chest, and my hand instinctively reached for the rusted latch on the door. I stopped myself just in time, pulling my hand back as if the metal had burned me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The candle on the table burned brighter, its light stretching across the room. The shadows it cast weren't natural, they twisted and curled, forming shapes that moved even though nothing else did. Another knock. I backed away from the door, my hands gripping the edges of the table for support. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to pulse under my fingers, as though alive. The whispering returned, faint at first, then growing louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. "Leave me alone," I shouted. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, the door handle began to turn. The metal creaked as it twisted, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken chair leg, and held it out like a weapon. My hands shook, and I could barely breathe as the door swung open. Nothing. The doorway gaped, revealing only the darkness of the forest beyond. The footsteps, the figure, the presence, they were gone. But the candle flame flickered violently, as if disturbed by an invisible gust of wind. The whispering surged, louder than ever, and this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin, surrounding me, pressing against my mind. Then I saw it. A shadow peeled itself from the corner of the room, stretching and elongating into a form that defied explanation. It wasn't human, it was wrong. Its shape shifted constantly, too tall, too thin, its edges blurring as though it didn't belong in this world. It had no face, but I felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting. I swung the chair leg wildly, shouting, "Stay back." The shadow didn't flinch. It moved closer, gliding silently across the floor. The candle flame dimmed, its light shrinking as the thing approached. Desperate, I grabbed the candle and hurled it at the shadow. The glass holder shattered on the floor, and the flame extinguished in an instant. Darkness swallowed the room. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice, low and guttural, speaking words I didn't understand, echoed through the cabin. The walls seemed to tremble with its power. A blinding light erupted from the shattered candle, illuminating the room in stark white. The symbols on the table flared to life, glowing with an unnatural brilliance. The shadow recoiled, its form distorting and writhing. I didn't think. I ran. Bursting through the door, I plunged into the forest once more. The light from the cabin faded behind me, replaced by the relentless darkness. The whispering followed, growing fainter as I sprinted blindly through the trees. Finally, I stumbled onto the path again, the same path I'd started on. The forest felt different now, less suffocating, but still heavy with an unseen presence. I didn't stop running until I saw the faint outline of my car through the trees. Collapsing into the driver's seat, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I sped away without looking back. As I drove, the whispering faded entirely. But the memory of the shadow, of the symbols, of that presence, none of it left me. And in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, I saw a faint flicker of light far off in the forest. The candle was still burning. The road twisted endlessly through the forest, its dark outlines clawing at the sky. I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure emerge from the darkness behind me. But the road remained empty, eerily quiet. The further I drove, the more I felt the forest's weight lifting, as though an unseen force was reluctantly letting me go. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the car's headlights slicing through the night. I should have felt safe. But I didn't. Reaching the edge of the forest, I finally saw the dim glow of a roadside gas station. Relief flooded me, and I pulled into the gravel lot, the engine sputtering as I killed it. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, their cold hum the only sound in the empty station. Inside, the attendant looked up, a bored expression on his face. He was an older man, with deep lines etched into his face and a newspaper spread out before him. "Rough night?" he asked, barely glancing at me as I stumbled in. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. What could I say? That I'd seen something in the forest, something that shouldn't exist? Yeah, I muttered finally. Something like that. He nodded knowingly, his eyes never leaving the newspaper. Lot of strange things happen out there. Best to stay clear after dark. I froze. What do you mean? The man shrugged, flipping a page. Locals say the forest doesn't like visitors. People go wandering where they shouldn't, poking around things best left alone. They see lights, hear voices. Most of them never come back. A chill ran down my spine. And the ones who do. His gaze finally met mine, his expression unreadable. They don't come back the same. I turned away, my stomach churning. The fluorescent light buzzed louder, grating against my nerves. Grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler, I tried to steady my breathing. As I approached the counter, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly dropping the water. The screen was blank. No call, no message. Just the date and time. But when I unlocked it, I found a new photo in my gallery. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, standing in the clearing with the candle behind me, the shadowed figure looming just at the edge of the light. "Ow," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The attendant looked up again. "Something wrong?" I shoved the phone into my pocket, my hands trembling. "No, nothing. Just tired." He didn't press further, and I left as quickly as I could. Back in the car, I locked the doors and sat in silence, gripping the phone like a lifeline. The photo stared back at me, proof that what I'd seen was real. But something was wrong. The timestamp on the photo wasn't from tonight. It was dated 3 days ago. My heart pounded as I scrolled through my gallery. More photos appeared, blurry, distorted images of the forest, the stone circle, the candle. And in every photo, the shadow was closer. I slammed the phone face down on the passenger seat, my breathing ragged. I started the car and drove, the need to put distance between me and the forest overriding every other thought. The highway stretched endlessly before me, the night seeming darker than ever. My headlights flickered briefly, then steadied. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to focus. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A faint glow, flickering at the side of the road. Another candle. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. My headlights illuminated the faint glow, a candle identical to the one in the forest, burning steadily by the roadside. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. This couldn't be real. I'd left the forest behind. I'd escaped. Hadn't I? The candle's flame didn't waver, even in the breeze that stirred the roadside grass. It beckoned silently, an impossible defiance against the natural order. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Not again." I pressed the accelerator, determined to leave it behind. But the car didn't move. The engine whined, the tires spun, but the vehicle remained rooted in place as if the road itself refused to let me go. The whispering returned. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was inside the car, surrounding me, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. The dashboard lights flickered, and my phone buzzed wildly on the seat. I glanced down. The screen was lit with another photo. This one showed the road ahead, taken from the perspective of my car. In the photo, the candle wasn't alone. The shadow stood beside it, its impossible form leaning toward the flame, as if whispering secrets to the fire. I whipped my head back up, and my heart nearly stopped. The shadow was there, standing beside the candle, just as in the photo. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me, its presence invading the space between my breaths. "Leave me alone," I screamed, slamming my fists against the steering wheel. The whispering surged, louder and more chaotic. The car shook violently, the windows fogging as if the air inside had turned to ice. And then, the flame flickered. For the first time, it seemed unsteady, as though struggling against an unseen force. The shadow leaned closer to it, its shape writhing unnaturally. The candle began to dim. A thought pierced through my terror, irrational but undeniable. If the candle went out, something far worse would happen. I didn't know how I knew this, but the certainty was absolute. I had to stop it. Throwing the car into park, I shoved the door open and stumbled out onto the road. The air was colder than I'd expected, biting through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. The whispering grew deafening as I approached the candle. My legs felt like lead, every step a battle against the invisible weight pressing down on me. The shadow straightened, its form shifting and crackling like static. It didn't retreat, but seemed to watch me with a cold, calculating stillness. I reached the candle and hesitated. What was I supposed to do? Pick it up? Snuff it out? Every instinct screamed at me not to touch it, but time was running out. The flame was guttering, shrinking with every second. The whispering changed, the voices uniting into a single word. Choose. My breath hitched. Choose? Choose what? The shadow shifted, its shape towering over me now, its edges curling inward like smoke. The flame shrank further, a trembling speck of light. I clenched my fists and made my choice. Grabbing the candle, I held it high and screamed into the night. The flame flared brightly, its heat searing my skin. The shadow recoiled, twisting violently as if in pain. The light grew brighter, blinding, consuming everything around me. The whispering turned to a roar, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my car, parked on the roadside. The engine was running, the headlights illuminating the empty stretch of road ahead. The candle was gone. I touched my hand, half expecting to find burns, but my skin was unmarked. Everything was as it had been before, except for the shadow in my rearview mirror. It wasn't moving. It wasn't fading. It was waiting. Have you ever noticed something so small and out of place that it made your entire world feel wrong? The day started like any other. I arrived at the office at 8:30, clutching my coffee and balancing a stack of reports. The elevator dinged as usual, and I stepped inside, already scrolling through my emails. That's when I saw it, a new button. It was subtle, placed below the usual numbers for floors 1 through 12. Unlike the others, this button was black, with a white -1 etched into its surface. I frowned. The building didn't have a basement. At least, not one I'd ever heard of in the 3 years I'd worked here. I glanced around the elevator, half expecting someone else to comment on it, but I was alone. The doors slid shut, and the hum of the elevator surrounded me as it ascended to my floor. My mind couldn't shake the image of that button. I told myself it was probably just a mistake, a malfunction, or some maintenance thing I wasn't privy to. But curiosity planted its roots. The morning passed in a blur of emails and meetings, but the button stayed in the back of my mind. During lunch, I mentioned it casually to Lisa, who worked in HR. Have you noticed anything weird about the elevator? I asked, stirring my coffee. She raised an eyebrow. Weird how? I hesitated, feeling silly. A new button. It says -1. Lisa blinked, then laughed. Basement level? Pretty sure there isn't one. I know, I said. That's what's strange. It wasn't there yesterday. She shrugged. Maybe maintenance added it? I wouldn't worry about it. But I did. By 3 o'clock, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My eyes kept flicking to the clock, counting the minutes until I could leave. I told myself I wouldn't press it. I'd just check to see if it was still there. At 5:30, I packed up and headed to the elevator. The hallway was quiet, most of my coworkers already gone for the day. The elevator arrived with a soft chime and the door slid open. The button was still there. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. The black surface seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights, daring me to touch it. No, I whispered to myself. It's just a button. But my hand moved on its own, trembling slightly as I reached out and pressed -1. The doors closed, and the elevator began to descend. The motion felt wrong immediately. It wasn't the smooth, steady glide I was used to. This was jerky, uneven, like the elevator was being pulled down by something too heavy. The lights flickered, and the hum grew louder, almost a groan. When the elevator stopped, the doors opened to reveal my office. Or at least, it looked like my office. The same beige walls, the same gray cubicles, even the same potted plants in the corners. But something was off. It was too quiet. I stepped out cautiously, my heels clicking on the tile floor. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, like the walls were too close, too hollow. I walked toward my desk, every nerve on edge. It was there, exactly as I'd left it, down to the mug of cold coffee. I touched the desk, and it felt solid, real. But when I looked at the computer screen, the desktop wasn't mine. It was blank, save for a single folder in the center labeled "Do Not Open." I stared at it, my fingers hovering over the mouse. Behind me, I heard the faintest sound, a shuffle, like fabric brushing against the floor. I froze. "Is someone there?" My voice cracked. No reply, just the faint, continuous hum of the air conditioning. I turned back to the screen. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I clicked on the folder. Inside was a single file, "You shouldn't be here.txt. A chill ran down my spine. Before I could open it, the sound came again, louder this time. A deliberate step. I spun around. The office was still empty. But the elevator doors had closed behind me. The elevator was gone. Where it had stood, there was now a blank wall, identical to every other in the empty office. I blinked, my breath hitching as panic rose in my chest. "No," I whispered, stepping toward where the doors had been. I pressed my palms against the smooth surface, searching for a seam, a panel, anything. But there was nothing. The silence around me felt oppressive, like a weight pressing on my ears. My pulse hammered in the void, and every sound I made seemed swallowed by the room. I turned back to the desk and the glowing monitor. The folder was still open, its name mocking me, "You shouldn't be here." I hesitated. There was no way this was real. It had to be a prank, an elaborate setup by some tech-savvy coworker. Lisa? Maybe the IT guy? But deep down, I didn't believe that. I clicked on the file. The text document opened, revealing a single line. "It's watching you." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, expecting to see someone, or something, behind me. But the office was still empty, its shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Hello? I called, my voice trembling. A faint click echoed from somewhere deeper in the office. It sounded like a door unlocking. I hesitated, torn between staying where I was and investigating the sound. Staying felt safer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening wouldn't stop until I confronted it. I grabbed a stapler from the desk, hardly a weapon, but it was better than nothing, and began moving toward the sound. The further I walked, the stranger the office became. The cubicles were there, but they weren't arranged as they should have been. The rows curved unnaturally, creating a labyrinth of gray walls. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their glow uneven. As I turned a corner, I froze. There was a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It was tall and unnervingly still, its back turned to me. It wore a suit, the kind I'd seen my coworkers wear 1,000 times, but something about its posture was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. "Hey!" I called, my voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, gripping the stapler tightly. "Who are you? What is this place?" Still, it didn't respond. The lights flickered, plunging the corridor into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. I turned, ready to run back to the desk, but the path behind me had changed. The cubicles were gone, replaced by a solid wall. "No, no, no," I muttered, spinning in circles. Every direction was different, the maze shifting around me. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from ahead. I forced myself to move toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I turned another corner and saw the source. At the end of the corridor was a window. But that didn't make sense. The office was underground. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. The window overlooked a vast, featureless void. There was no sky, no ground, just an endless expanse of black. And pressed against the glass was a hand. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its nails were sharp and jagged. The hand tapped against the glass, a slow, deliberate rhythm. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The glass began to crack, hairline fractures spreading outward like a spider's web. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of footsteps. I turned, but the corridor was empty. When I looked back at the window, the hand was gone. But the cracks remained, and they were spreading. The cracks on the glass spidered out in jagged, deliberate lines. Each one seemed to pulse, glowing faintly, as if the void beyond was alive and pushing to break through. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. None of it was possible. The tapping started again, louder and more frantic, though the hand was gone. It echoed in time with the cracks, and I realized with dawning horror that the glass wouldn't hold much longer. Behind me, the shuffling footsteps grew louder. I spun around, clutching the stapler like it was a lifeline. The corridor stretched into darkness, but I could feel it, something moving, drawing closer. "No," I whispered, backing toward the window. "Stay away." The lights overhead flickered, buzzing like angry insects. In the brief flashes of darkness, I saw glimpses of the figure again, its tall, unnaturally rigid form stepping closer with each flicker. I pressed myself against the wall beside the window, heart pounding. "What do you want?" The figure stopped just at the edge of the shadows. Its head tilted, the movement sharp and unnatural, as if it didn't understand the question. The glass beside me groaned, and I turned to see the cracks spreading faster now, pulsing with an eerie white glow. The void beyond was no longer empty. Shapes writhed within it, indistinct but unmistakably alive. The tapping shifted, becoming a steady pounding. The fractures deepened, tiny shards of glass falling away, revealing slivers of the void. And then I heard it. A voice, no, many voices, whispering from the other side. They overlapped, chaotic and disjointed, but one word stood out among them. Stay. The pounding ceased abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. I looked back at the figure. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its focus on me, oppressive and all-encompassing. The voices from the void spoke again, louder this time. Stay. I shook my head, panic clawing at my chest. No. I don't belong here. The figure stepped forward, emerging fully into the flickering light. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank. Smooth, featureless skin stretched taut where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. It raised a hand, pointing past me, toward the window. The glass gave a final groan and shattered. I screamed, shielding my face as the shards rained down. The void surged forward, a cold, unrelenting force pulling at me. I grabbed at the edge of the broken window frame, the sharp metal biting into my palms. The void roared, its voices blending into a deafening cacophony. Behind me, the figure moved closer, its steps deliberate and unhurried. I felt its presence looming over me, its attention like a weight on my back. The voices changed again, now pleading. Stay with us. The pull from the void grew stronger, and I felt my grip slipping. I looked back, desperate for an escape, and saw the figure standing over me. Its hand reached out, but not to push me. It was offering. The same folder I'd seen on the computer now appeared in its hand, stark and black against the pale, featureless skin. The figure tilted its head again, as if waiting for me to take it. I didn't know why, but I felt a terrible certainty that this was a choice, a final, irrevocable decision. Take the folder, or let the void take me. The voices quieted, whispering now in unison. Decide. Tears streamed down my face as I stared at the folder. My hands burned from the effort of holding on, but I knew I couldn't last much longer. With a shaking hand, I reached out and grasped it. The figure recoiled instantly, its form dissolving into smoke. The void pulled back as if repelled, the roaring replaced by silence so absolute it made my ears ring. The broken window was whole again, the office restored to its eerie, empty state. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching the folder to my chest. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The words were already burned into my mind. You're one of us now. The lights overhead flickered one last time, and the elevator doors appeared where the wall had been. I stumbled to my feet and stepped inside, my body trembling. I pressed the button for the lobby, refusing to look back as the doors closed. The elevator ascended smoothly, and when the doors opened again, I was back in the real world. At least, I thought I was. But the folder was still in my hand. I stood there in the lobby, the familiar hum of the building surrounding me. The sounds, the flickering lights, the mundane office chatter, it was all the same. But nothing felt real anymore. I looked at the folder in my hands. The black exterior, the cryptic label "You're one of us now," the weight of it. It was the only thing that anchored me to the experience, to the terror I'd just escaped, or thought I had. The elevator doors slid shut behind me, and I was alone in the empty lobby. The receptionist's desk was abandoned, the chair pushed back, the space oddly vacant. I started to walk toward the exit, my mind racing, heart still pounding in my chest. The world around me felt distant, as if I were looking at it from the other side of a glass. I could hear the muffled voices, the distant footsteps of coworkers, but it was like they didn't belong to me. I stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the office building looming behind me. The city was alive, buzzing with the usual traffic, the people hurrying home, the lights twinkling like they always did. But the world felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't put it into words, but the quiet hum in the air, the buzz beneath my skin, told me something had changed. The folder felt heavier in my hands, its blackness swallowing the light around me. I gripped it tighter, but it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, like it was drawing me deeper into something I didn't understand. I turned back to the building, suddenly desperate to get inside. When I opened the door to the lobby, everything was exactly as it had been when I left, empty. There was no one at the receptionist's desk. No footsteps, no voices. It was eerily quiet, the air stale with the scent of old paper and lingering cold. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing. My hands trembled as I reached for the elevator button, but I knew it was pointless. I didn't need to press it. I knew exactly what would happen next. The doors opened before I even touched them. I stepped inside, the elevator just as silent as before. The button for my floor was still lit, but this time there was another button. The familiar black -1. I hesitated. The last time I pressed it, everything had shattered, the office, the world, the reality I thought I knew. Now, it stood there, staring at me, daring me to press it again. I could feel it in my bones. The pull. The knowing. It wasn't over. I pressed it. The elevator descended, slower this time, its movement almost deliberate. The hum was deeper, more resonant, as if the building itself were holding its breath. When the doors opened, I wasn't in the office. It wasn't the office at all. I stood in a vast, empty space, white walls stretching endlessly around me. There were no windows, no doors, just cold, sterile emptiness. The air was thick with a strange pressure, like the world itself was holding something back. I took a step forward, my shoes clicking on the smooth floor. I could hear the faintest whisper, not from the walls, but from within me, creeping into my mind. "You're home." I spun around. The elevator doors had disappeared. There was no way back. I felt my throat tighten, panic rising. No, this isn't real. The whispers grew louder, no longer a distant hum, but a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison. The words were clear now. "Welcome back." I backed up against the cold wall, my breath shallow. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up. But then I heard it, the tapping. The same rhythm, the same sound I'd heard before, echoing through the emptiness. I turned to see the figure again. It was standing at the far end of the space, the same rigid, unnatural posture. But this time, its face. I could see it. It was mine. I staggered back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, disjointed, like it was copying me. The voices whispered again, but this time I understood. "You are us. You are home." The figure stretched out its hand toward me. The same hand I had seen before. the same hand that had held the folder. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The space around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing forward, the voices swelling, until there was no room for anything else but the figure's outstretched hand. And then, just as I was about to reach out, the world shattered again. But this time, I wasn't sure if I was still in the same world. I blinked, disoriented. The world around me was different. The empty, sterile space was gone. The cold walls had melted into familiar gray cubicles. I was standing in the office again, the same office, with the same dull lights overhead and the same silence pressing in on me. But something was wrong. I wasn't alone. Across the room, I saw her, a woman I didn't recognize. She sat at a desk, typing away on a keyboard, her back to me. Her hair was neatly pulled into a bun, her posture perfect, like a reflection of everything I once was before this madness started. I couldn't breathe. It was me. I stepped forward slowly, my footsteps making no sound on the carpet. The woman didn't turn. She just typed. Her hands moved mechanically, the motions too smooth, too practiced. And then I saw it, the flicker in her reflection. She wasn't typing. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not touching them at all. She was watching me. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as she slowly turned to face me, her eyes blank, empty. The smile on her face was wrong, too wide, too forced. "You're back," she said in my voice. I recoiled, my mind spinning. No, this isn't possible. Her eyes flickered with an emotion I couldn't read. She tilted her head, like she was studying me. "You've been here before," she said. "This is home. We're all part of it now." I stepped back, my breath quickening. The office seemed to stretch farther, growing larger, more oppressive. "No," I whispered. "I don't belong here. I'm not like you." The woman stood, her movements eerily fluid. Her face, the one that was mine, didn't change. But her eyes, they were different. Empty. As if something had already taken over. "You're wrong," she said softly, taking a step closer. "You are one of us now. You've always been." I backed away, my mind racing for an explanation, for some way out. But every direction led me back to her, to the same cubicle, to the same desk. The elevator doors were behind me. I spun toward them, desperate to escape. But they were sealed shut, as though they had never existed. The hallway had disappeared. I was trapped. The woman, me, came closer, her smile widening. The space around me distorted, bending like a funhouse mirror, warping the office into impossible angles. The shadows in the corners shifted, and the air turned cold. "Why are you fighting it?" she asked, her voice low and soothing, as if this were some normal conversation. "You've been here before. We all come back eventually." I backed into the desk, my breath shallow. "I'm not like you," I repeated, though my voice faltered. The certainty was slipping away. "I can't be." She tilted her head, as if considering my words. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine but felt strangely familiar, she said, "It's already too late." Before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. The walls groaned. The space folded in on itself, twisting, as if the office was being consumed by something darker. The lights flickered violently, casting the room into an ever-shifting pattern of shadows and light. In the midst of the chaos, I saw her again, standing in the doorway. The woman, the reflection of me. But this time, there was no smile. Only the hollow stare. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. And in that silence, everything snapped. The room fractured, splintered like shattered glass, and for the briefest moment, I felt my body weightless, like I was floating through some void. The voices, the whispers, grew louder, deafening. They filled my head, every corner of my mind, and I couldn't tell where I ended and the voices began. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. I stood alone. The office was gone. The figure was gone. The whispers were gone. I was back in the lobby. The elevator doors opened before me, just as they had before. The button for my floor was still glowing, and the empty lobby stretched in front of me. But now, there was nothing. No receptionist, no sounds. Just the heavy silence. I glanced at the folder still clutched in my hands. The words on the front had changed. Welcome home. I didn't know if I could take it anymore. But before I could think, I stepped inside the elevator. And as the doors closed, I pressed the button for my floor. The elevator ascended smoothly. But this time, I wasn't sure what waited for me at the top. Have you ever felt that strange, unsettling moment when something ordinary becomes not so ordinary? That moment when reality shifts just enough for you to doubt everything you thought you knew? I remember it so clearly. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of gray, overcast day that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. I was on my way home from work, just another ordinary commute, familiar faces, the usual tired conversations, and the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels on the tracks. The kind of monotony that lulls you into a false sense of security. But then, I noticed something. A ticket. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the blur of the city as it passed by, when a small slip of paper landed softly beside me. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash someone had dropped. But when I looked closer, I saw it wasn't. It was a ticket. A single, folded piece of paper with a strange, intricate symbol on it. I unfolded it carefully. There was no destination written, just that strange mark, a spiral with a line cutting through it. I didn't recognize it. I looked around the train, but no one seemed to notice. The man sitting across from me was reading his newspaper. The woman next to me was texting, completely oblivious. No one else saw the ticket. I looked at it again, the weirdness of it gnawing at me. Who would leave something like this on a crowded train? I hesitated for a moment. Then, I tucked the ticket into my coat pocket. Maybe it was just some kind of prank or a mistake. But something about the symbol seemed important. The more I thought about it, the more it nagged at me. When my stop arrived, I stood up to leave. But as I walked toward the door, I felt a strange pull, like something was holding me back. My hand hovered near the handle, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should just take the ticket and throw it away. But before I could make a decision, I stepped off the train. It was then that I realized something was wrong. The station didn't look right. The air felt heavier, colder somehow. The lights flickered faintly above me, casting long, stretching shadows that twisted unnaturally. I looked around. The platform was almost completely empty, the usual bustle of commuters gone. I glanced up at the clock, just past 6, but something about it didn't add up. The time seemed wrong. Where was everyone? I walked to the exit, but the door didn't open. It was stuck. I tugged harder, the metal cold under my fingers, and when it finally gave way, the air outside was still. Too still. There were no sounds. No cars. No people. Just an eerie, unbroken silence. I stepped into the street, looking around. The city should have been alive, but it was empty, as though the world had simply stopped. I turned back to the station, confused, my breath quickening. That's when I saw it, the sign above the entrance. The name of the station was unfamiliar. Vostok Station. I'd never heard of it. I had lived in this city my whole life and had never once come across a station by that name. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence, but as I looked around, I realized there was nowhere to go. The streets were unfamiliar, even though they looked exactly like the ones I knew. The buildings loomed over me, dark and silent, their windows empty like dead eyes. And then, I heard something. A faint scraping sound, distant but growing closer. I froze, straining my ears. It was the sound of footsteps. Someone was walking toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could see the outline of a figure at the end of the street. It was tall, shadowy, and moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt the pull to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure grew nearer, its shape more distinct. I could see the outline of a hat, a coat, but no details. No face. And then, as it reached the intersection just ahead of me, it stopped. I stood there, frozen, watching. I had no idea what to do, no idea who or what this person was. But I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. The figure remained still, standing in the center of the street, waiting for something or someone. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Just disappeared into the air, like it had never been there at all. I blinked, disoriented. Was I imagining it? Had the stress gotten to me? But no! I looked down at my hand. The ticket. It was still there, folded neatly in my palm. But the symbol had changed. It was now glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie light. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just an ordinary train ticket. This was the beginning of something else. Something I couldn't yet comprehend. A journey that had just started, and I didn't know where it would lead. I stood there, still gripping the ticket, feeling its warmth against my palm as if it was alive. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, and I tried to gather my thoughts. The street was eerily quiet, and the building across from me, once familiar, now seemed strange, unnatural, as though its structure was just a facade masking something far darker. The shadows between the buildings stretched impossibly long, as though they were trying to pull me toward them. I had to move. There was no one around to ask what was happening, no one to tell me where I was or how I'd gotten here. The silence was suffocating, and every step I took seemed to echo, bouncing off the deserted buildings with a hollow, unnatural sound. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, loud, panicked. Something was terribly wrong. I turned back toward the station. The sign, Vostok Station, was still there, flickering faintly in the dim light. I approached it cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me closer. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand. The doors were open now, though I couldn't remember hearing them open. The air inside was cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. As I stepped inside, the lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow on everything. The station was empty, just as the street outside had been. No people, no voices, just the silence. And the quiet hum of the lights. A chill ran through me. It was the kind of cold that felt like it had been waiting for me, like it had always been here. The walls were cracked, and the floor was littered with dust and debris, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this place had been abandoned for much longer than it appeared. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. There were no clocks, no signs to indicate where I was or where I should go. The only thing that stood out was the strange symbol on the ticket in my hand, now glowing more brightly, almost as if it was alive, pulsing with a rhythm of its own. The glow seemed to grow stronger the further I walked into the station. It wasn't until I reached the far end of the platform that I saw it. A train. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The train was old, its surface tarnished and rusty, and yet it looked brand new. It was like it didn't belong here, like it was a relic from another time, or worse, another place. The doors were open, but I couldn't see inside. It was as though the interior was swallowed by darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. A sudden sound snapped my attention back to reality, footsteps. I whipped around, heart racing. But there was no one there. I could feel it, though. Someone, or something, was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I instinctively clutched the ticket tighter in my hand. Then I heard it again. A soft rustling sound, like someone shuffling just beyond my line of sight. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. And it was coming from the train. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was inside. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, carrying me toward the train. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to see what lay beyond that dark threshold, but my hand was already reaching out, and before I could stop myself, I stepped onto the train. The door slid shut behind me, and the train jerked to life. The darkness inside wasn't just a lack of light, it was something more. It felt heavy, suffocating, as though it was pressing in on me from all sides. The air was thick, stale, and I could taste the dust and decay in my mouth. I fumbled for a seat, but the train car was empty. No other passengers, no conductor, just rows of seats that seemed to stretch on forever, far beyond what should have been possible. The walls of the car were covered in grime, the windows cracked and fogged, and yet the train was moving, its motion smooth and deliberate. I looked down at the ticket in my hand once more. The symbol was now a faint outline, as if it was fading away into nothing. And then, the train came to a stop. The sudden jerk made me grip the seat in front of me. The lights flickered, and the doors slid open with a screech that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked out. The platform was empty, just like before, but now it felt different. The space was twisted. The station had transformed into something darker, almost unrecognizable. The walls had caved in slightly, the architecture shifted in unnatural ways, as though the very structure of the place had been corrupted. And that was when I realized I wasn't alone. At the far end of the platform, I saw figures standing in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, tall, motionless, but somehow familiar. It felt like I had seen them before, but I couldn't remember where or when. A strange, oppressive silence hung in the air. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears as I took a step forward. But the moment my foot touched the platform, the figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, its shadow stretching unnaturally long as it approached. I froze. And then I heard a voice. "Welcome home." It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement. One that filled me with dread, one that confirmed everything I had feared. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting for me. And I had just arrived. I stood frozen, my body stiff with fear as the figure approached. The voice had reverberated in the empty station, its words ringing in my ears like a warning, a death knell. "Welcome home." The figure, tall, indistinct, yet undeniably human, moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps heavy and echoing, each step reverberating in the stillness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. It was too close, too familiar, like a shadow that had followed me through time, waiting patiently for me to realize it was always there. I stepped back instinctively, my breath coming faster now. I wanted to run, to get away, but my feet refused to obey. The weight of the air in the station was pressing down on me, like invisible hands holding me in place. The figure came closer. And then, in the coldest, most unnerving voice I've ever heard, it spoke again. "You shouldn't have come." The words seemed to carry a deeper meaning, something hidden beneath the surface, something I wasn't meant to understand. Something I wasn't supposed to question. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My voice was trapped in my throat, as if the very act of talking might cause the world around me to shatter. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, its form flickering as though it were caught between two worlds, like a shadow on the edge of reality. The darkness that surrounded it seemed to bend and warp the space around it. And then I saw it, a faint glow beneath its dark cloak. A symbol, the same symbol that had been on the ticket. It pulsed in rhythm with the fading light of the station. I reached into my pocket, where the ticket was still crumpled in my hand. It was warm to the touch, its symbol now shining brightly, its edges curling as if alive. The figure stepped forward again. This time, I could see the outlines of its face, though it was not a face at all. It was a blank, featureless void, a mask of emptiness, as though no one had ever truly worn it. "You have already begun the journey," it said, its voice soft yet unmistakable in the quiet. "There is no turning back." I wanted to scream, to break free of the paralysis that had gripped me, but my body refused to listen. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, but my feet were like roots, tethered to the ground. I glanced around. There was no exit, no way to go back. The station had become a labyrinth, the walls closing in, bending toward me like a cage. The figure raised a hand, and the air around me thickened. It was as if the world itself had started to distort, like looking through warped glass. I saw the station flicker, its walls trembling, and I felt the ground beneath my feet shift. I wasn't in a station anymore. I was somewhere else. A cold wind blew, rustling through the empty platform, and the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, forming in clouds before me. The figure began to dissolve, fading into the shadows, its form stretching and warping like it was made of smoke. I reached forward, desperate to stop it, to understand, but the moment my fingers touched the fading figure, the world exploded in darkness. I fell, or at least I thought I did. The sensation of falling was overwhelming, but I wasn't sure if my body was actually moving. The cold seemed to wrap around me like a suffocating blanket. And then, everything went silent. I opened my eyes. I was back on the train. The same old, rusty train. the same dim, suffocating darkness. My hands were trembling, the ticket still clutched in my palm. But this time, something was different. I was no longer alone. The train car was now filled with people, but they weren't people at all. They were reflections. Their faces were blank, featureless, just like the figure at the station. They sat in their seats, unmoving, staring straight ahead, as though waiting for something to happen. Their clothes were familiar, but out of place, like echoes of reality distorted by time and space. I stood up quickly, heart racing. The air was thick with something wrong. The walls of the train car seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, stretching and contracting like a living thing. I turned to look out the window, but all I could see was blackness. And then I heard a sound, soft, almost inaudible, but growing louder. It was the sound of breathing. But it wasn't coming from the people in the seats. It was coming from behind me. I turned around, but nothing was there. Only the empty seats and the shadows stretching across the car. I could feel something, someone looming behind me, pressing against me. The air around me seemed to thicken. And then I heard the voice again. Time is not what you think it is. The voice was soft, cold, and distant, but it sent a chill through me, the words slipping into my mind like poison. The sound of breathing grew louder, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just one person. There were many of them, all standing behind me, their presence suffocating, their invisible eyes watching me. I wanted to turn around, to scream, but I was rooted in place, just like before. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape, but I couldn't move. The reflection of my face appeared in the glass, but it was wrong. My eyes were hollow, empty, just like theirs. And I realized then, I wasn't on a train anymore. I was trapped. Trapped in a place where time had no meaning, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. A place where I was just another reflection, waiting for something to come. Waiting for something that was never meant to happen. The train began to move again. And as it did, the shadows around me deepened, pulling me toward them, pulling me into the unknown. And I understood. I was not escaping this. I was just following the path. And there was no way out. The train moved, its screeching wheels cutting through the thick silence like a knife through soft flesh. The tracks ahead stretched into the void, the endless blackness consuming any sense of direction. There was no way to tell if we were even moving forward or if we were simply spiraling deeper into an abyss. The reflections around me were still. Their faces had not changed, their eyes locked straight ahead. I could feel the weight of their gaze, as if they were aware of me, watching my every move. But they never reacted, never acknowledged me. They were as much a part of this place as the walls, the seats, the darkness itself. I glanced down at the ticket in my hand. The symbol was still glowing faintly, but now it looked more like a warning than an invitation. I could almost feel a pulse in my palm, resonating with something deep inside me. The train's rhythm was hypnotic, pulling me deeper into its motion, like a lullaby, calming and unsettling at the same time. I tried to stand, but the moment I did, the breath in the air thickened, and a heavy pressure pushed me back into my seat. It was as if the very atmosphere of the train was designed to keep me confined. I was trapped, but worse, it felt as though I had been here before. The reflection of myself in the glass began to move independently of me. My hands twitched, my eyes shifted, but the reflection was still. I froze. I watched as my reflection's mouth opened slowly, but no sound came out. Its eyes locked with mine, and I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. The reflection smiled. A slow, empty smile. I jerked my head away, eyes wide with panic, but when I turned back to look, it was gone. Just like that, vanished into the glass, leaving only the empty eyes of the other passengers. I couldn't breathe. The air was thin, suffocating. I tried again to stand, this time with more force, pushing against the invisible force that held me. My fingers clung to the seat, nails digging into the fabric. But the train didn't stop. I reached for the door, pulling it open with all the strength I could muster, but there was nothing on the other side, only more darkness. It stretched endlessly, just like the tracks. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, desperate to find some sense of reality. And that's when I noticed it. In the corner of the car, a shadow. It moved, slow at first, then quicker, like it was crawling toward me. I couldn't tell if it was real or another manifestation of this place, something made of the same nothingness that surrounded us all. But I knew it was there, closing in. The breathing had returned, louder now, coming from the shadow. It seemed to grow with each passing second, swelling until it felt as though the entire train was exhaling as one. I turned toward the other passengers, but their faces remained unchanging, frozen in their places. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but no sound escaped my throat. The shadow lurched closer, and I felt a coldness sweep over me, as though the temperature of the air had plummeted. My skin tingled, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I stepped back, stumbling toward the back of the car, eyes darting around, searching for any escape. But there was none. It was as if the train itself had no end, no exit, no destination. I thought I saw something, then, a flicker of light, a tiny glow in the distance, far down the tracks. It was faint, but it was there. A sign of something different, something outside of this place. Without thinking, I pushed forward, moving toward the light, the only hope I had. The shadow was still there, moving closer with every step I took, its breathing more erratic, as if it could feel the urgency in my movements. I reached the window, pressing my hands against it, my breath fogging up the glass. The light, whatever it was, had grown brighter, clearer. But then, I saw it. The reflection of the shadow on the glass. It wasn't just the shadow anymore. It was something else. It was me. The reflection of myself stood behind me, its eyes wide, its mouth moving in sync with the shadow's slow approach. It was as if it was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. But I couldn't understand. I turned, heart racing, but the shadow was upon me now, the air growing thick with its cold presence. It was suffocating. It was consuming. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow stopped. It hovered in front of me, its form shifting, distorting, as if it were trying to show me something that I wasn't meant to see. My reflection, that smile. No. I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to know. But it was too late. The shadow stretched out its hand, and in that instant, everything snapped back. The lights went out. The train screeched to a halt. The world around me collapsed. And there was nothing. Just blackness. When I woke, I was no longer on the train. I was standing in the middle of a bustling street. People walked past me, unaware, as if nothing had changed. As if I had never left. I looked around, disoriented, my heart still pounding in my chest. The sounds of the city surrounded me, horns honking, people laughing, the hum of daily life. It was all so normal. But it wasn't. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the ticket once more. The symbol was still there, faintly glowing, but something was different. It had changed. It was no longer the same symbol I had seen before. It was incomplete. A broken mark, a fractured shape. I looked up. The street around me seemed to blur at the edges, the buildings flickering in and out of focus, like a glitch in the fabric of reality. I was back, but I wasn't. And the ticket in my hand, it had no destination. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the busy street, the ticket still clutched tightly in my hand. The world around me felt off, like a broken mirror reflecting a distorted version of reality. The faces of the people passing by were blurred, their movements mechanical, as if they weren't real at all. Their eyes didn't meet mine. They couldn't. The buildings, too, seemed to flicker in and out of existence, their shapes warping like they weren't quite sure where they belonged. It felt as if the world was only half-formed, a simulation that had started to glitch, and I was somehow caught in its collapse. I tried to walk, but my feet felt heavy, like I was walking through water. Each step was a struggle, and I could feel the weight of something watching me, pressing down on me from all directions. I turned around, hoping to see something familiar, some sign that I was truly back, that I hadn't lost my mind completely. But when I looked, I was met with nothing but the endless street, the same people, the same flickering buildings. I raised the ticket again, staring at it with a mix of disbelief and fear. The symbol had changed even further. It was no longer a clear shape, it was jagged, like the edges of something torn apart. And then, for a split second, I saw it. At the very bottom of the ticket, there was a line of text. It was written in small, almost invisible letters, and I could barely make it out, but when I did, the words struck me like a cold wave. You never left. A cold rush of dread washed over me. The air grew thick, and the noises of the city faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I was standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by people who weren't really there, in a world that wasn't real. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled. Not a simple rumble, this was deeper, more profound, as if the very foundation of the world was cracking. The buildings around me began to sway, their shapes twisting unnaturally, and I could hear something faint but unmistakable, a soft whisper, like a distant voice calling my name. It was coming from all around me, from the air itself. I spun around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. No one. Just the same empty faces, the same flickering surroundings. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was calling to me, pulling me in, dragging me deeper into the madness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world was collapsing on itself, and I was trapped in the middle of it. The ticket. I looked down at it again, desperately searching for any clue, any sign of what was happening. And then I saw it. The symbol on the ticket, the jagged, broken shape, shifted again, this time into a sharp, pointed figure, like an arrow, its tip glowing faintly in the darkness. It was pointing at something in the distance, something I couldn't see but somehow knew was there. I had no choice. I began to walk toward it. The whisper grew louder as I moved, and with every step, the world around me seemed to warp more. The edges of the street blurred, the sky twisted, and the air grew colder. I followed the arrow, the path unclear but strangely familiar, like I had walked it before. And then, I saw it. The end. It wasn't a destination. It wasn't a place. It was just a door. The door stood at the edge of the street, glowing faintly in the darkness, its frame cracked and weathered. There was no sign above it, no indication of what lay beyond. But I knew I had to open it. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. The moment my hand touched the cold metal, the door swung open, and everything stopped. The city, the people, the whispers, everything. There was no sound, no movement, only darkness. I stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind me. The world was gone. The street, the people, the noise, it had all vanished, leaving me alone in a vast, empty space. I didn't know where I was, or if I was even anywhere at all. It was as if I had been erased. But then, I heard something. A soft, steady thrum like the beat of a distant heart. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I had never really left. I was still there, stuck in that place, walking the endless loop, following the ticket, following the symbol. It had no end. There was no escape. And the whispers, those voices, would never stop calling. Not until I understood. Not until I found the answer. And I knew that answer was somewhere deep within the darkness. Have you ever had that feeling that someone is watching you, even when you're completely alone? It's an unsettling sensation, like a weight pressing on your chest. I never thought it would become real until it did. It was a regular Thursday morning when I decided to fix the ventilation system in my apartment. The air had been a bit stale lately, and I figured it was time for some maintenance. The apartment building wasn't exactly new, and I had already seen its fair share of repairs in the past. The walls had cracks, the floor creaked, and the pipes always seemed to make strange noises. But I had grown used to it. I gathered my tools and started with the vent in the kitchen, thinking it would be a quick job. I unscrewed the cover and peeked inside. The vent was dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light. I ran my flashlight over the interior, looking for any visible blockages, but everything appeared to be clear. Then, as I moved the light deeper, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, perhaps some dirt or reflection. But as I focused, I could make out a faint shape, something round and smooth, staring back at me. It was an eye. It wasn't just any eye. It was an unsettling, almost unnatural eye. It stared at me, unmoving, unblinking. I froze. My heartbeat accelerated, and a chill ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some sort of optical illusion caused by dust or debris inside the vent. But the longer I stared, the more real it seemed. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. What was I looking at? How could there be an eye inside the ventilation system? I reached out, trying to cover the vent again, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The eye remained, unblinking, staring directly at me. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of my brain told me to leave it alone, to cover the vent and pretend it never happened. But something deep inside me screamed to investigate further. What was behind the vent? Who was behind it? I took a step closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The eye didn't move, but I swear I could feel it following my every movement. Without thinking, I grabbed the screwdriver again, determined to unscrew the vent cover completely. My hands were slick with sweat as I twisted the screws loose, one by one. The eye never blinked. It just stayed there, watching. Finally, with one last screw, I removed the vent cover. I braced myself, half expecting something to jump out at me. But there was nothing. The vent was empty, save for some dust and a few small cobwebs. I stared inside, confused. Where had the eye gone? Had I imagined it? I didn't know what to think. But as I turned to leave the kitchen, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a whisper, barely audible. Hello? I spun around, my heart racing. The apartment was still, silent. No one was there. The voice had come from inside the vent. But the vent was empty, wasn't it? I walked back toward it, my mind racing. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Help me. It was a desperate, pleading sound. And then, something moved. I could feel it. The air in the apartment shifted, growing colder, thicker. I reached out to touch the edge of the vent again, and that's when I heard it, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the walls. I stepped back, my body going rigid. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, but I felt the presence of someone, watching me. I bolted for the door, grabbing my coat and running out of the apartment. My mind was in a frenzy, the events of the morning spiraling into chaos. But as I reached the stairwell and glanced over my shoulder, I saw it, there, on the wall of the hallway, reflected in the cracked glass of a door. The eye. It was still watching me. I didn't know what it was, or who it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back into that apartment again. I thought I had left it behind, but it followed me. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at my thoughts. The eye. The voice. The footsteps in the walls. They were no longer confined to that apartment. I had taken something with me, something that wouldn't let me go. For the next few days, I tried to go on as if nothing had happened. I went to work, met friends for coffee, and did all the usual things I did before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, even in the crowded streets or at my desk at the office. My reflection in the windows seemed different, like something was lurking just out of view. I began to doubt my own sanity. One evening, unable to take the pressure of it anymore, I called the building superintendent. I needed answers. I had to know what had happened, what I had seen, and why the apartment seemed to have transformed into something wrong. The superintendent, an older man named Greg, answered with a calm, almost detached voice. When I mentioned the strange happenings in my apartment, there was a long silence on the other end. Did you see it? He finally asked. See what? I replied, my voice trembling. The eye, Greg whispered. It's been there for years. Every tenant who's ever lived there has seen it. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Why is it there? Greg sighed, his voice heavy with a sense of dread. No one really knows. The apartment has a history. People say it's a place where things get trapped, things that shouldn't exist in this world. The eye, it's part of that. It watches, waits, and once it locks onto you, it never stops. I felt the room spin around me as his words sank in. How do I make it stop? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Greg didn't answer right away. You can't, he said finally. Not without leaving. For good. The apartment doesn't let go of its inhabitants easily. I felt the blood drain from my face. Leave? But where would I go? I can't just run away from this. You've already run, Greg replied, his tone cold. It's already following you. If you go back to the apartment, you'll know what I mean. I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to think that it was all just in my head, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The eye had followed me out of the apartment. It had followed me into the world, and no matter where I went, I couldn't escape it. That night, I went back. I don't know why I did it. I think part of me hoped that maybe I could face it, confront whatever was haunting me, and end this nightmare once and for all. I stood outside the building, staring up at my apartment window. It looked so ordinary, so calm, but I knew better. The air around it felt thick, heavy. It felt wrong. As I stepped into the building, the familiar smell of dust and old wood filled my nose. My heart hammered in my chest as I made my way up the stairs, past the old, creaking doors. I reached my apartment door and hesitated, but something pushed me forward. Something was calling me. I opened the door and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. But it didn't feel the same. The silence was oppressive, thick like a physical presence. The air seemed colder now, the shadows deeper. I approached the vent, my eyes drawn to it, almost against my will. I stood there, staring at the place where the eye had been. There was nothing there now, only emptiness. But I could feel it. The eye. It was there, hidden, watching. And then, I heard the voice again. Help me. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clearer, stronger, coming from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was still, too still. Leave now, the voice said, its tone colder than before. Or it will take you. I backed away, my legs shaking. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze away from the vent. I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned around. In the dim light of the apartment, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a shadow, but its shape was unmistakable. The figure was tall, looming, its face hidden in darkness. And then I saw it. The eye. It wasn't an event. It was in the figure's face, glowing faintly, staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as the figure took a step forward. Run, the voice commanded, but I couldn't move. I knew then that there was no escape. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, constricted as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of me. The figure, if it could even be called that, was advancing slowly, its eye fixed on me, burning through my skin. The darkness around it seemed to swallow the light in the room, making everything else fade away into a void. My body refused to obey my mind. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure spoke again, but its voice was no longer a whisper. It echoed in my mind, reverberating in a way that made my teeth ache. You cannot leave, it said. The eye sees everything. You are mine. I tried to blink, tried to tear my gaze away, but the eye pulled me like a magnet. I felt trapped. A prisoner in my own apartment, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a pressure, like something inside me was being crushed. I gasped for air, clutching at my ribs, but the sensation only grew stronger. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me, squeezing me from all sides. I had to get out. I had to escape. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced myself to take a step back. Then another. And another. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the sound deafening in the silence of the apartment. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, unmoving, its eyes still burning into mine. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It was waiting. I turned and ran. My feet barely touched the floor as I dashed for the door. The hallway outside was dark, eerily quiet. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath, harsh and uneven. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was too terrified to glance over my shoulder to see if it was following me, if it had already claimed me. I burst through the front door of the building and out into the street. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and biting. I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that I had to get away, had to outrun whatever was chasing me. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, it was always there. I could feel it, feel the presence behind me. I couldn't escape it. It was as if the entire city had been swallowed by the same darkness, the same looming terror. I stumbled into a nearby alley, breathless and disoriented. My chest ached from the effort, and my legs felt like they were going to give out beneath me. I leaned against the cold brick wall, trying to steady myself. I pressed my hands to my face, willing the world to stop spinning. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. The eye. It wasn't an event. It wasn't in the figure. It was in the world itself. The buildings around me, the streetlights, the shadows, they were all filled with eyes, watching, waiting. The entire world was staring at me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice was gone. I was alone, and yet not alone. The eyes were everywhere, in everything, and they were closing in. And then, I felt it, the presence again, just behind me. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't need to look to know what it was. It was here. My body froze in place. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down, suffocating me. I dared not move, terrified of what I might find if I did. I could feel the eyes, dozens, hundreds, thousands of eyes, burning into me, their gaze unblinking, unrelenting. And then, just behind me, a whisper. A low, guttural sound, like something ancient, something not meant for human ears. I forced myself to turn, but my legs shook uncontrollably, threatening to give way beneath me. The alley was empty. Yet, the presence was still there. I could feel it, a weight on my chest, an oppressive force closing in around me. Turn around, the voice hissed. It was softer now, almost gentle, but the malice was undeniable. You're so close. Just one more step. I didn't understand. My mind was a whirlwind, thoughts racing in every direction. What did it want from me? What was happening? I glanced around, searching for an escape, but the alley seemed to stretch on forever, its walls looming higher than they should. There were no exits, no windows, no doors. Just the crushing dark and those eyes, ever present, watching, waiting. I took a step back, only to realize that the alley was no longer the same. The streetlights that once cast long shadows were now flickering erratically, their dim glow only making the darkness feel deeper. The walls of the buildings had shifted, closing in around me, their surfaces smooth and slick, as if the very reality around me was being warped, bending to something I couldn't comprehend. A sharp noise echoed in the distance, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, growing louder with every passing second. I wasn't alone. I spun around, looking for the source of the sound, but there was no one there. Only the darkness, pressing closer. Only the eyes. And then, out of the corner of my vision, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the alley. Tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, bending at odd angles. Its face was obscured in shadow, but the eye was visible. It was huge, impossible to miss, and it was staring straight at me. The air grew colder. The chill seeped into my bones, freezing me in place. The footsteps continued, now closer, closer, closer. But I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey me. I was trapped. The figure took another step forward, its form warping, shifting in the darkness. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its face. It was as though the eye was everywhere, watching from all angles, from every surface. I could feel it inside me, too, like something was crawling under my skin, invading my mind. Suddenly, the figure spoke. Its voice was not a whisper this time, but a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You've been chosen," it said. "You'll never escape. You're part of this now." A scream tore from my throat, raw and desperate, but it was drowned by the growing cacophony of the whispers, the voices of 1,000 eyes, all speaking at once, all calling my name. I turned to run, but the alley was no longer the same. The ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple, shifting like water, making it impossible to keep my balance. I stumbled forward, trying to find some solid ground, but the world kept warping around me. The walls closed in, the floor disappeared, and I was falling into an abyss of eyes. And then, everything went silent. I don't know how long I fell. It could have been seconds or hours, or maybe even days. Time had no meaning in that place. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that stretches until you can hear your own pulse pounding in your ears, as if the world had stopped and left me in a vacuum. I braced myself for impact, expecting to crash into something solid, but when my feet finally touched the ground, it was soft, too soft. Like sand or dirt, but smooth, like it wasn't real. I looked around. I had landed in what appeared to be a vast, empty space. The walls, if you could call them walls, seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, an endless void of darkness punctuated only by the flickering glow of distant lights. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of something rotten, like decay. I couldn't tell if I was underground or in some dimension entirely removed from reality. The landscape around me shifted, undulating like a living thing, yet it remained eerily still. The eyes were here, too. Everywhere. Watching. But now, they were smaller, scattered across the walls, the floor, and even in the air around me, like faint pinpricks of light. I couldn't escape them. No matter where I turned, no matter where I looked, they followed me, their gaze unyielding. I tried to take a step, but the ground felt wrong beneath me, like it wasn't real. My foot sank slightly with every step, as though the very fabric of the place was unstable. And then I heard it again, the voice. A low, gurgling sound, like a whispering wind through cracked glass. "You've come far," it said. "Farther than anyone before you." I froze. I knew that voice. It was the same one from the alley, the same one that had haunted me in the moments before I fell. It was the voice of the figure, the one with the eye. The figure stepped forward from the shadows, its form no longer stretching and warping, but now solid, almost human. It was tall, its features obscured in darkness, but the eye was still there, staring at me from the center of its face. A massive, unblinking orb that burned with an unnatural light, its gaze piercing through the blackness like a beacon. "You're not supposed to be here," it said. "But now that you are, there's no going back." I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The fear was too overwhelming, too suffocating. The figure's eyes seemed to grow, expanding as it focused on me, and for a moment, everything around me seemed to collapse into it. The walls, the floor, the air, all of it funneled into that single, all-seeing eye, and I felt like I was falling into it, losing myself, becoming a part of it. "You'll stay here with us," the figure said, its voice now a twisted melody of whispers and screams. "You've already seen too much. You belong here. Forever." The room seemed to warp again, the floor tilting as if gravity itself had been thrown out of balance. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, my mind screaming for release. I could feel the pressure building inside me, the weight of everything, the eyes, the whispers, the darkness, crushing me. I was suffocating. And then, as if something snapped, I heard a loud crack, a sharp, breaking sound, followed by silence. The world around me stopped moving, the pressure disappeared. I was no longer on the ground. I wasn't falling. I was back. I blinked. I was back in my apartment. The walls, the furniture, the light, everything was exactly as it had been before. My heart raced in my chest as I looked around, disoriented. Had it all been a dream? Some sort of hallucination? I tried to steady my breath, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. I moved cautiously toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. But then, just as I was about to open it, I froze. In the corner of the room, I saw it. The eye. It was watching me again, this time no longer in the ventilation shaft, but on the wall itself. It was staring, unblinking, waiting. And I knew, in that moment, that I would never be alone again. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you could hear a warning from your future self? What if that warning was not about something vague, but about your own death? Would you believe it? Would you be able to stop it? I never thought I would have to find out. It was an ordinary Wednesday. I had just gotten back home from work, tossed my bag onto the couch, and kicked off my shoes, ready to unwind. I lived alone, and the silence of my apartment was usually comforting. But that day, something felt different. There was an odd energy in the air, a tension that I couldn't quite place. I set my phone on the coffee table, not bothering to check it. It had been a long day, and I needed some peace. But then it rang. I glanced at the screen, my own number was calling. I froze. I hadn't set my phone to show my own number. It was impossible. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way someone could call me from my own phone. I stared at the screen for a moment, unsure what to do. The ringing continued, each sound like a hammer hitting my skull. My hands were shaking when I picked up the call. "Hello?" I said, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. There was a long pause before the voice on the other end answered. It was my voice. My exact voice, but somehow different. Hollow. Tense. "You need to listen to me," it said. "You're in danger. You need to leave your apartment. Now." I stared at the phone in disbelief, my mind racing. My throat felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. The voice on the other end continued, but the words felt like they were crushing me. "You won't believe me. You'll think this is a prank or something, but I'm you. From the future. I don't have much time, so listen carefully. There's someone coming for you. They're already inside your building. Don't trust anything you hear, anything you see. Get out. Now. My legs felt weak. I couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. But somehow, I knew deep down that I wasn't dreaming. This wasn't some twisted joke. This was real. The voice continued, faster now, more frantic. You have to go. There's no time. Just run. Don't look back. Trust me, you have to leave. Before I could say anything, the call ended abruptly. I stared at the phone in my hand. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. What just happened? Was that really me? How could that be possible? I stood there, frozen. The room around me felt different now, heavier, somehow. The silence had grown oppressive, the air thick with a kind of unseen pressure. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner of the room was the only sound that broke the silence, but it felt out of place, unnatural. I looked around the apartment, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced. My pulse pounded in my ears. What was going on? I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was some kind of sick prank, but I couldn't ignore the fear that had already taken root. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze again. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The knock was slow, deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was there. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The voice on the phone, my own voice, echoed in my head. Don't trust anything you hear, anything you see. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I slowly, cautiously, stepped toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Then, a voice, one I didn't recognize, came from the other side. I know you're there. Open the door. I stumbled back, a sick feeling in my stomach. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. But I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to do something. I had to find out what was happening before it was too late. My hand tightened around the doorknob. But the moment I touched it, I heard something. Something that made my blood run cold. A voice, my voice, whispered from behind me, soft and almost drowned out by the sound of my own breath. Don't open it. My heart stopped. The voice was unmistakable. It was my own voice, soft and filled with an urgency that sent a wave of terror rushing through me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. But there was nothing behind me. The apartment was still, empty, just as it had been moments ago. I stood frozen for a few seconds, staring at the empty room. The voice, my voice, had been so real, so close. It was like a shadow whispering in my ear, a voice that shouldn't have been there. I swallowed hard, my hands clammy, my stomach a knot of dread. I glanced at the door again. The knocks had stopped, but I knew someone was still there. Someone, or something. I backed away from the door, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at me. I needed to think, to figure out what was going on. The voice on the phone, the warning, my own voice behind me, it was all too much. Too many pieces that didn't fit together. I turned toward the window, hoping the view outside would ground me, would remind me that I was still in control. But as I looked out at the street below, my mind raced with 1,000 questions. What if the voice was real? What if someone was coming for me, just like I had heard? How could I stop it? I glanced back at the door once more, then quickly pulled my phone from my pocket. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the dialer, but something held me back. What if it happened again? What if I called the wrong person, or worse, no one at all? I let out a shaky breath and stuffed the phone back into my pocket. I couldn't sit here and do nothing. I had to act. The quiet of the apartment pressed down on me, thick and heavy, like I was drowning in the silence. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, louder than the air conditioning, louder than any other sound in the room. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, like a warning shot. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I try to escape through the window? But then, just as I started to move, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. My pulse quickened. I froze again, listening intently. The footsteps were slow at first, almost as if they were waiting for me to make a move. Then they grew louder, more urgent, as if they were closing in on the door. The hallway outside my apartment was completely silent just moments ago. Had I missed something? Was someone already inside? I backed up toward the kitchen, my mind racing. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't focus. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. There was a knock again. This time, softer. Hesitant. Almost like a whisper. "Open the door," came the voice again, but this time it wasn't the same as before. This voice was different, older, deeper, distorted. I moved to the other side of the room, trying to keep my distance from the door. A chill crawled down my spine, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in my apartment. I didn't know what was on the other side of that door, but I could feel it. Something was waiting for me, something that I wasn't prepared for. And then, the phone buzzed in my pocket. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my hand instinctively reaching for it. My breath caught as I looked at the screen. It was a missed call. From my own number. I stared at the phone for a moment, my hand shaking, the fear growing inside me. I felt like I was losing control, like I was caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Before I could think any further, I heard it. The sound of the door handle turning, slowly, agonizingly slow. The door was opening. I didn't know if I should run. I didn't know if I could fight whatever was on the other side. All I knew was that I had no choice. And I had no idea what I was about to face. The door creaked open with a soft, groaning sound, as if it were reluctant to reveal whatever waited on the other side. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped backward, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move, to do something, anything, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't make myself move any closer to that door. The handle stopped turning, but the door didn't close. It was ajar now, just enough for the creeping shadows outside to pour in. The dim light from the hallway spilled over the threshold, casting elongated shapes across the floor. But there was nothing there. No figure standing in the doorway. No one was waiting for me. I exhaled shakily, letting out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe I was just imagining it. Maybe this was all some sort of weird trick of my mind. Maybe the phone call had been nothing but a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. Something that went beyond any ordinary explanation. I could still hear the muffled sounds from the hallway, the soft shuffle of shoes against the floor, the faint rustle of fabric. Whoever, or whatever, had been knocking was still out there, just beyond the door. I could feel its presence, like an invisible weight pressing against me. Another soft knock echoed from the other side. I flinched. The voice, too, it was there again, calling out from the darkness. This time, it wasn't speaking to me directly, it was a soft murmur, as if it were whispering into the very air itself. "Don't open the door." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The whisper wrapped itself around my mind like a vice, squeezing tighter with every passing second. I looked around the apartment in a panic, desperately searching for somewhere to go, something to do. But there was nowhere. I couldn't escape. The walls were too close, the rooms too small, the windows too high up. The phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, I pulled it from my pocket, my thumb hovering over the screen. The missed call had been unsettling enough, but this time I couldn't ignore it. The notification read, "Incoming call." From my own number. I stared at the screen, my breathing shallow and erratic. I knew, without a doubt, that I shouldn't answer. I shouldn't let that voice reach me again. But some part of me, some twisted, curious part, urged me to pick it up. I pressed the green button before I could stop myself. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, the line went dead. I waited. My pulse raced. My hand gripped the phone so tightly my fingers ached. But there was no voice. No words. Just silence, thick and suffocating. And then, I heard it. The same voice. But this time, it wasn't on the phone. It wasn't from the hallway. It was coming from inside my own mind. "You shouldn't have answered." The words sent a jolt through me. The voice was distorted now, garbled, like a broken signal trying to break through the static. But there was no mistaking it. It was mine. My own voice, but somehow wrong. I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat as my eyes darted around the apartment, searching for the source of the voice. There was no one here. No one but me. The air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. The shadows deepened, curling in on themselves, distorting the familiar shapes of the furniture. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to know what else it had to say. But the fear that gripped me wouldn't let go. It pushed me forward, urging me to pick up. I pressed the screen with a trembling finger. "Hello?" I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding of my heart. But there was only static. Thick, crackling static that seemed to fill the room. The longer I listened, the more distorted the sound became until it was a maddening hiss. And then, clear as day, cutting through the static, came a single word. "Run." I snapped the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen as if it held the answer to everything, but it was just a blank display. No call. No messages. Nothing. And then, just as I was about to drop the phone and flee, I heard the door creak open wider. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was moving out there. Something was coming. I had to decide. I could stay here and wait for whatever was lurking to come inside, or I could run. But no matter which I chose, I knew one thing for certain. There was no escaping the truth. I wasn't alone. And whatever was waiting for me, whether it was a person, a ghost, or something else entirely, it was already inside my head. I ran. There was no time to think, no time to second guess. My feet carried me toward the hallway, away from the door, away from the ever-encroaching presence that seemed to be drawing closer with every breath. My mind screamed for me to leave, to escape, but where would I go? Where could I hide from a presence that seemed to have slipped into my very mind? I reached the front door, hands fumbling desperately for the keys in my pocket. My fingers were slick with sweat, trembling so badly that I almost couldn't get a grip on the metal. Every creak of the floor beneath me seemed too loud, as if it was echoing through the walls, calling attention to my movements. I could feel the presence behind me, closing in, a weight in the air that seemed to press against my back. I managed to force the door open, a rush of cold night air greeting me as I stepped out onto the balcony. The city below was quiet, too quiet. No traffic, no distant voices, no familiar hum of life. It felt like the world had gone silent, waiting for something. I glanced back at the apartment. The door stood wide open, the shadows inside dark and unsettling. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Just beyond the threshold, something shifted. Something was in there with me. Run. The voice, my voice, whispered again, but this time it wasn't in my head. It came from behind me. From the apartment. I turned to look, my heart threatening to explode in my chest, but there was nothing. No figure standing in the doorway. No shadow, no movement. Just the cold, empty silence. But I knew what was waiting for me. I knew what was about to happen. I didn't need to turn around to know that whatever had been knocking at my door, whatever had been speaking to me, was now out there, somewhere, just beyond the edge of the balcony. I could feel its gaze, like eyes boring into the back of my skull. It knew where I was, and it was coming. The phone buzzed again in my pocket, this time more urgently, as if it were alive, pressing me to answer. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But the fear, the overwhelming, suffocating fear, made my hand move before I could stop it. I pulled the phone out and pressed it to my ear, even though I knew it was a mistake. It rang once. Twice. And then the voice, my voice, was there again. You don't understand. The words were distorted, a jumble of panic and static. But there was something else in that voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was a warning, a plea. It's already too late. The call cut off abruptly, leaving me standing there, shaking in the cold night air. I looked at the phone again, but it was blank now. No call, no messages. Nothing. I dropped the phone, the device clattering against the ground below, and looked around at the empty streets below me. For the first time, I realized how truly alone I was. The silence around me was deafening, suffocating. I needed to leave. I needed to run. But the feeling, the overwhelming certainty that something was waiting for me, kept me frozen in place. Every part of me screamed to go back inside, to lock the door, to hide somewhere, anywhere. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The thing that was after me wasn't bound by the laws of reality. It was beyond that, something older, something that couldn't be locked away or ignored. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. It started as a whisper, barely audible, but grew louder, like a swarm of bees descending upon me. My breath hitched in my throat as the sound turned into something more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps, getting closer. The sound echoed through the apartment, through the building, as if it were coming from every direction at once. The rhythm of the steps was familiar, too familiar. I took a step back, my pulse racing, eyes darting around for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No one in sight. Yet, the sound grew louder, closer. closer still. And then, as if on cue, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The apartment was locked. I was trapped outside, exposed. I turned and ran down the narrow staircase of the balcony, each step sending a jolt through my body, my head spinning. The weight of the situation was unbearable. I needed to escape. But every path seemed to lead to the same conclusion. I couldn't outrun it. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the alleyway, my footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The city felt like a maze, a twisting labyrinth where every corner could lead to something worse, something more sinister. And then, without warning, a sharp pain shot through my chest. I gasped for air, the breath freezing in my lungs. The pain wasn't physical, not exactly, but it was a suffocating weight, an invisible force pressing down on me from all sides. I staggered to the side, clutching my chest, and looked around. The shadows had deepened, and the city that once felt familiar now seemed foreign, hostile. I had no idea where I was going, no idea what I was running from anymore. But then I realized I wasn't running from something. I was running towards something, and it was waiting for me. The alleyway seemed to stretch on forever, an endless path that looped back into itself, like the twisted corridors of a nightmare. I ran, but no matter how fast I moved, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, thicker, closing in around me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort, but the suffocating pressure in my chest never let up. I was being hunted, and every step I took only led me deeper into its grip. I stumbled to a halt, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. The alley was silent now, unnaturally so. The buzzing, the footsteps, the hum from earlier, they were gone. The world had gone still. But the stillness was the worst part. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. I could feel it. The presence was near. It was closer than it had ever been, and the weight of it pressed on me like a physical force, pushing me to the brink of madness. I swallowed hard, willing myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I couldn't let it get the better of me. I turned, scanning the surroundings, and that's when I saw it. There, at the far end of the alley, was a figure. Tall, hooded, its shape indistinct, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. It stood perfectly still, watching me, waiting for me. The figure's presence felt like a cold, creeping dread, filling me with an urge to run, to hide, to do anything but face it. But my legs refused to move. I could hear my own heartbeat now, thumping in my chest, but it was drowned out by the thudding of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate steps that sounded far too close for comfort. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only the empty, silent alleyway behind me. My skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. It was then that I realized the truth. The footsteps weren't coming from behind me. They were coming from inside my head. A voice, that same distorted version of my own, echoed in my mind. It wasn't the voice on the phone, not quite, but it was the same, familiar yet alien, full of urgency and fear. You have to listen. The voice was sharp, urgent. A warning. But a warning about what? I wasn't sure I could trust it anymore. I didn't know where it was coming from, or even if it was real. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just a dream? The figure at the far end of the alley shifted. It didn't move in the way that a person would. It was as if it unfolded, the darkness around it warping and twisting. For a moment, I thought it was just an illusion, but then I saw its eyes. Two glowing orbs, piercing through the blackness of its hood, staring directly at me. I gasped, my legs finally giving way as I collapsed to my knees. The weight of its gaze felt like a physical force, crushing me under its stare. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, as if I were suffocating. The figure took a step forward. Another. Each movement was deliberate, measured. It wasn't rushing. It didn't need to. It knew I couldn't escape. It knew I was already trapped. You can't run from me. The voice spoke again, louder now, clear and cold, as if it were coming from every direction at once. It was my voice, but not my voice. I closed my eyes, tears spilling down my face. There had to be something I could do. I had to find a way out. But how? How could I escape from something that was inside me, something that had already marked me as its prey? The figure's hand reached out, and I felt the air grow colder. It wasn't a physical touch, but the sensation of something reaching inside me, pulling at the edges of my consciousness. The world around me began to warp, the alleyway distorting and bending. The walls seemed to ripple like water, and the ground underneath me became unstable, shifting as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just happening to me. I was part of it. I was the cause. I had called it. It wasn't a force from outside. It was a force from within me, from my own mind, from my own future. And now, I was paying the price for looking too far ahead. There's no escape. The last words, spoken by my own voice, came from every direction at once, filling the space around me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world around me collapsed into darkness. And I knew then there was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. Have you ever been alone in your own home when everything is quiet and yet something feels off? It's that feeling, that sense that you're being watched, that something is not quite right. Maybe it's just your imagination. Maybe not. It was a calm night. The kind of night where the house settles, the wood creaks, and the faint sound of wind brushing against the windows seems like nothing more than the usual. But for me, that night was different. I live in an old house. It's small but cozy, with squeaky floors and walls that hold memories of a time long past. I've always loved it here, even though there were nights when the shadows seemed to linger a bit too long or the silence felt too heavy. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was just me at home. I had been working late, finishing up a project on my laptop. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and I decided it was finally time to call it a day. I got up to stretch, feeling the coolness of the evening air seeping in through the cracks in the window. Everything seemed fine. That's when I heard it. A creak. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. At first, I thought it was the house settling, a natural sound in an old building. But then I heard it again, longer, a little sharper this time. The stairs. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I was alone. I checked every room before sitting down to work, and there were no other cars parked outside. I was sure I was the only one here. I waited, straining to listen, but there was only silence. The kind of silence that feels thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, the creak came again. This time, it was closer. It echoed through the house, a low, groaning sound that made my skin crawl. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking up the stairs. I rushed to the door, thinking maybe it was the wind or an animal, something that could explain the noise. But as I opened the door, I saw nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway and the stairs that led to the second floor. Nothing. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at the empty space, my mind racing. Was I hearing things? I was so sure someone had been walking up those stairs. The noise, the sound of the floorboards groaning under weight, how could I have imagined that? I stood there for what felt like hours, just listening. But no more sounds came. Everything went back to normal. The house was still. Too still. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly closed the door, not entirely convinced that I was alone. The next morning, I got out of bed early, hoping that the odd events of the previous night were just a product of too much work and not enough sleep. But as I walked through the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the dusty floor, were the faintest marks. Barefoot prints. I knelt down, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the tracks. They were clear enough. Fresh enough. They weren't mine, and I had definitely not walked barefoot across the floor after the night I had. The prints led from the stairs, where I had heard the sounds, down the hall and toward the kitchen. There was no way these could have been left by anyone else. I had locked the door the night before, and no one had been here since. The prints, the creaks, the silence. It all came rushing back to me. Something or someone had been here. Something I couldn't see. And it was still here, watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe I had just overlooked the prints. Perhaps they were from something I hadn't noticed the night before. Maybe I had accidentally left the door open and some small animal had wandered in. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. That crawling sensation on the back of my neck, the way the air felt thick, like something unseen was hovering just out of reach. The prints, though faint, were impossible to ignore. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the trail of barefoot impressions in the dust. My heart was pounding again, faster this time. My breath was shallow, and I had to force myself to look away from the floor. I glanced toward the stairs, where I had heard the creaks. The very thought of those sounds still sent a chill through me. The image of something, or someone, slowly creeping up toward me haunted my thoughts. I reached for my phone, hoping to call a friend, anyone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. The silence around me was unbearable. The kind of silence that amplifies every small sound. Every breath, every shift in the house felt deafening. I thought about going outside, about calling the police, but something stopped me. A voice in my head told me to stay put, to wait, to listen. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that whatever was happening, it was only just beginning. I backed away from the prints and walked over to the stairs. Slowly, cautiously. The house was old, and every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more. That I needed to confront whatever this was. I checked every room on the second floor. The closets. The bathrooms. The attic. But there was no one. Just silence. I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. The house seemed empty, but not in the usual way. It felt empty in a way that was unsettling, like there was a space being occupied by something I couldn't see. I walked back down the stairs, glancing again at the prints. They were still there, still leading down the hall. But now, they seemed to be fresh. Almost as if someone had walked through the dust just moments ago. I wasn't imagining it. I followed the trail down the hall, my pulse racing. The prints led into the kitchen, stopping at the threshold. But there, in the middle of the floor, was something else. A single piece of paper. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I hadn't seen it when I first entered the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat as I walked toward it, bending down to pick it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and folded in a way that suggested it had been sitting there for a long time. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling. The paper was covered with strange symbols, ones I didn't recognize. The symbols were drawn in black ink, some of them overlapping each other in ways that made no sense. The feeling of being watched intensified, my breath growing heavier as I read the symbols. But then something made me stop. My eyes locked on the last symbol. It was a circle with a jagged line cutting through the middle. And underneath it, written in small, uneven handwriting, was a single word. Run. The breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. Who had left this? Why? Suddenly, the sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the silence. And the overwhelming feeling that something was very wrong. I stood frozen, staring at the door, trying to piece together what had just happened. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to leave before whatever was here found me. But before I could take a step, the floorboards creaked behind me. Softly at first, then louder, closer. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking up the stairs. And this time, I wasn't imagining it. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound of the footsteps on the stairs was real, too real. Each creak was like a nail being driven into my chest, the air thick with fear. My heart hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable, someone was coming up. The stairs creaked with each step, each one deliberate and slow, like they were savoring the fear they were causing. My mind raced. Who could it be? I had checked the entire house. I had locked the doors. I was sure no one was here. The steps didn't stop. They reached the landing, just outside the kitchen, and then silence. For a moment, I dared to hope it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind, or a trick of my imagination. But then, a cold draft swept through the kitchen, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath in the air, despite it being warm earlier in the day. Then, the sound of breathing. Soft, uneven, like someone was trying to control it, but failing. It came from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing so fast I could hardly catch my breath. But again, nothing. The kitchen was empty. I was alone. I could still hear the breath, though. It was so close it sent a wave of panic through me. The breath wasn't mine. It wasn't from anyone I knew. It was wrong, alien in its unevenness. I looked down at the paper again, the one with the symbols, the word run still etched in my mind like a curse. The house was closing in on me. Each creak, each breath, each cold gust of wind felt like a trap tightening around me. I needed to act. I couldn't stay here any longer. But where could I go? There was no one to call, no one to help. I was alone. Completely alone. I took a shaky step toward the door, but as soon as I moved, the kitchen light flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, consuming. My pulse quickened. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. I had to find the light switch. I had to see. The silence was deafening now, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. My fingers fumbled along the wall, but then I felt something else. Something cold. A hand. I gasped and pulled back, but the grip tightened, firm but gentle. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I didn't know if I would even be heard. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the feeling of the hand tightening. A soft laugh, low and hollow, came from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I wasn't alone, and yet I could see no one. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. Tall and looming, standing just at the edge of the kitchen door. I could barely make out the outline of a figure, but it was enough. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The air around it seemed to grow colder still, the room feeling smaller with each step it took. My breath was shallow, my body frozen with terror. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have stayed. The voice was the same as mine. It was me. But it wasn't. The words hung in the air, a warning. A threat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My own voice, twisted into something unfamiliar, sent a surge of horror through me. The figure was getting closer. I felt the cold touch of it on my skin, but I couldn't look away. The room seemed to warp around me, stretching and contorting like the walls themselves were alive. The floor beneath me cracked, splitting open, revealing darkness. The darkness wasn't like the night. It wasn't empty. It was hungry. A gust of cold air blew from the open crack, the smell of earth and decay flooding my senses. I staggered back, my heart racing, but I couldn't stop myself from being drawn toward it. The figure, it was me. My own reflection, or what was left of it, standing in the shadows. It's too late for you now, it whispered, the voice echoing inside my skull. I stumbled back toward the door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked, jammed. Panic surged through me as I tugged at the handle, desperate to escape. But the figure was there, closer now, its breath hot on my neck. I could hear the creak of the stairs again, this time from above me, as though something was descending toward me from the dark. I was trapped. And I knew I wasn't alone. The door refused to budge, no matter how hard I yanked at the handle. The figure was standing just inches from me now, its form flickering in and out of focus, as if the shadows themselves were trying to swallow it whole. It was me, but it wasn't. It had my face, my voice, but something about it, the way it moved, the way it breathed, was wrong. I stumbled backward, my body refusing to obey, as if it was caught between flight and fight. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure smiled, a twisted, hollow smile that sent a shiver through my spine. You can't escape, it murmured, the words crawling under my skin. This is where you belong now. I slammed my shoulder into the door once more, feeling the pressure of the handle against my palm. The coldness of the room pressed in on me from every direction, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, the figure reached out, its hand grasping mine in a vice-like grip. The contact sent a jolt of ice through my veins, freezing me in place. I could feel its fingers digging into my flesh, its touch so cold that it made my bones ache. The darkened room around me seemed to close in even further. The shadows twisted and writhed, becoming alive with silent whispers. I could hear them, voices, growing louder, their murmurs almost drowned out by the eerie silence. And then, one voice cut through it all. "Help me." The words were faint at first, so soft they could have been a figment of my imagination. But then they grew clearer, louder. "Help me, you have to help me." I turned, but the room was empty. Only the figure stood there, still holding my hand. I jerked my arm away, the coldness of the touch lingering like frost on my skin. My heart was racing, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The shadows closed in even tighter, squeezing me with an unbearable pressure. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was suffocating. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "You have to help me." The walls were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. The figure watched me silently, its expression unreadable, its form slowly fading into the dark like smoke. I gasped, trying to force the words out. "I can't help you. What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, the smile never leaving its face. "You can't escape. Not this time." And with that, it faded into the shadows completely. For a moment, I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The pressure around me had lifted, but I could still feel the weight of its presence, hovering at the edges of my mind. My eyes scanned the room, but it was empty. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, nothing had changed. Except for one thing. The marks. There, on the floor, beneath the dust and grime of the hallway, were the faint impressions of bare feet. The shape of toes, the arches, the heel, each one perfectly defined, as though someone had walked through the dust just moments ago. But the prints weren't mine. They were too small, too delicate. And they led straight to the stairs. My heart skipped a beat. The stairs. That's where the figure had gone. That's where the sound of footsteps had come from. I was being hunted. It wasn't just a haunting, it was something more. Something real. I forced my feet to move, my legs shaking beneath me as I made my way to the stairs. The creaks of the old wooden steps seemed to mock me, each one louder than the last, as if the house itself was alive and aware of what I had seen, what I had discovered. I reached the top of the stairs, my fingers grazing the railing as I moved cautiously down the hall. Every step felt heavier, every creak in the floorboards more ominous. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure behind me, but the hallway was empty. I reached the door to the attic. I had never been up there before, but I knew deep down that this was where it all began. The whispers, the footsteps, the strange marks on the floor. It all led here. The handle turned with ease, as if it was waiting for me. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of decay hanging in the air. Old boxes were stacked haphazardly around the room, but there was something more, something moving. I could feel it. The tension was so thick it was suffocating. I moved inside slowly, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The shadows seemed to grow darker as I stepped further in, and the silence was broken only by the soft whisper of my own breath. Then, I saw it. A mirror, large and cracked, standing against the far wall. It was the only thing in the room that looked out of place, untouched by time or decay. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. The reflection staring back at me was wrong. The figure was there, standing behind me in the mirror, its face twisted and mocking. But it wasn't just behind me. It was beside me. It was me. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold glass. And as I did, the reflection smiled. "I told you," it whispered, the voice now unmistakably mine. "You can't escape." The mirror cracked further, splintering like glass shattering, and in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. I stood frozen, my hands still hovering over the shattered mirror. The fragments of glass seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if they were alive, as if they could reach out and claim me. The smile of the reflection, my own twisted reflection, lingered in my mind, a sinister reminder that something or someone was always watching. I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me, desperate to get away from the oppressive weight of the attic. The air was thick with an unnatural coldness, and I could feel it creeping under my skin, biting at me. I had to leave. I had to escape. But the moment I turned to leave, I heard it. A soft creak. The floorboard beneath my feet groaned. I froze again, eyes darting to the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, a footstep. A slow, deliberate creak, as if someone was climbing the stairs, one step at a time, drawing closer. I wasn't alone. I spun around, scanning the attic for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, except for the creaking, now louder and clearer with each passing second. There was no one in the room, nothing out of place, but the air felt thick with an unseen presence. I rushed toward the door, my breath shallow, but as my hand gripped the handle, I hesitated. The footprints on the floor, the whisper in the shadows, the figure in the mirror, they were all connected. The house had been quiet for so long, but now it was alive with a menacing energy. A cold sweat clung to my skin, and my heart beat faster. The creaking grew louder. I knew what I had to do. I had to face it. I couldn't keep running, not anymore. Whatever this was, whatever this thing had become, it wasn't going to stop until I did. I turned back toward the stairs, swallowing the lump in my throat. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable now, growing closer and closer until it felt as if something was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I could almost feel its presence, its coldness, pressing in on me. The creaking stopped. I took a deep breath and descended slowly, my hand gripping the railing as if it would steady me. The house felt too still now, too quiet. But I could still feel it, the sense of being watched, the dread that clung to every inch of the space. The air was heavy, thick with tension. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, my eyes scanning the hallway. The door to the living room was ajar, and I could see the faint outline of something moving within. My breath hitched. Was it waiting for me? Or was it something else? I crept forward, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The shadows stretched longer now, the room bathed in a dim, sickly light. I pushed the door open cautiously, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was still, but I could hear it now, whispers. Soft, murmuring voices that seemed to come from every direction, wrapping themselves around me like a suffocating fog. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. My gaze fell to the center of the room, and there it was. The figure. It stood in the middle of the room, just as it had been in the attic. But this time, it wasn't alone. The room was full of them. Dozens of figures, each one a distorted version of me. Some were standing motionless, others were moving around the room, their faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. And they were all watching me. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel my legs giving out, but I refused to let myself fall. I had to stay in control. I had to understand what was happening. One of the figures stepped forward, its eyes locked on mine. It was me, but not me. The same twisted smile, the same hollow eyes. It reached out, its hand slowly extending toward me. "You should have never come back," it said in my voice, low and menacing. I stumbled back, my mind racing. "What do you want from me?" The figure's lips curled into a grin. "We are you. And you are us. You can't escape." I backed away faster, feeling the pressure of the room closing in on me. The figures circled, their movements too synchronized, as if they were all part of some grand design, some terrible plan. They reached for me, their hands cold and clammy. I couldn't breathe. The room spun, and the walls seemed to close in. My vision blurred as I fought to stay upright. "No, I won't," I gasped, but the words died in my throat. The figure closest to me reached out with long, thin fingers, wrapping them around my wrist. Its grip was like ice, pulling me closer. And then I saw it, the reflection in the mirror. Not the one in the attic, but the one in the living room. It was me again, but my reflection was smiling, no, grinning. The reflection reached out, its hand slamming against the glass, trapping me in a corner, trapped in a room with no way out. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the room, swallowed by the house. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figures vanished. The whispers died. The room was silent once more. I was alone again. But the house felt different. The air was still thick with an unsettling presence. The walls, the floor, the very space itself seemed to have shifted. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was part of me. And I was part of it. I glanced around, my heart still racing, trying to make sense of everything. But there was no sense to be made. Nothing was real. It never had been. The creak on the stairs echoed in my mind, a reminder of everything that had happened. And now, it was all gone. Or maybe it was just beginning. The house, the figures, the whispers, they were waiting. And I knew, deep down, that they were never really gone. They were always there. Waiting. Watching. Waiting for me to come back. Have you ever received a letter that was never meant for you? It sounds impossible, right? A letter with your name on the front, yet the words inside seem to belong to someone else. Or maybe they weren't even meant for anyone at all, except perhaps the ghosts of the past. That's what happened to me. It began with an envelope. A simple, unassuming envelope that would go unnoticed if it weren't for the name written in elegant script on the front, my name, but also the name of someone I hadn't heard from in years. I had to look twice to believe my eyes. It wasn't just the name that caught my attention. The address, the postmark, everything about the envelope felt wrong. It had no return address, and there was no indication of who could have sent it. But somehow, in the pit of my stomach, I felt the weight of its presence. Like an unwelcome guest, it seemed to whisper my name even before I opened it. The moment I slid the letter out, a strange chill ran down my spine. The paper was thick, almost too thick, and there was an odd, almost imperceptible scent lingering in the folds. I unfolded it slowly, as if unsure of what I might find. The handwriting inside was familiar. Too familiar. It was written in the same neat, flowing script I recognized from a decade ago. The same handwriting from someone I once knew, someone I had lost touch with long ago. His name was Daniel, and we had once been inseparable until time and life drew us apart. But here it was, his handwriting, as though he had never left. As though nothing had changed. I began to read. Tomorrow, you will wake up to an ordinary morning. But the world will shift when the clock strikes 7. At that exact moment, something will happen, a choice you make will seal your fate. You will not see it coming. Do not ignore this warning, for it is your only chance to change what is coming. I blinked. The words seemed absurd, yet they felt so real. My mind raced, trying to piece together some meaning, but nothing made sense. How could he know what was going to happen tomorrow? And why, after all these years, would he send me a letter like this? I looked back at the letter, my fingers gripping the edges, trying to find something, anything, that could explain this. But there was nothing. No further message. Just those haunting words, written with the same urgency that I had always associated with Daniel. It had been years since I last thought of him. The last time I saw him, he had been a different person. Strange things had started happening around him, things that couldn't be explained. And then he disappeared. No goodbye. No warning. Just gone. And now, here I was, holding a letter that seemed to come from someone who had never left, as though time had forgotten to pass. As I set the letter down, my mind whirled with possibilities. Could it be some kind of joke? Some twisted prank from the past? Or was it something more? The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its rhythmic sound echoing through the room, each tick a reminder of the moment I was approaching. Tomorrow would come, whether I was ready for it or not. But Daniel's words lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was already unfolding. Something I couldn't control. And I had no idea what I was about to face. I went to bed that night, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The letter lay on my nightstand, an eerie reminder of what was to come. The room seemed quieter than usual, and the air felt dense, as though it were holding its breath. But sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, the words from the letter looping in my head. At 7, you will make a choice. What kind of choice? And what would happen if I made the wrong one? The darkness around me seemed to grow heavier as the night wore on. The quiet was oppressive. The stillness of the house felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every small sound, every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence. My heart beat faster, but I didn't know if it was from fear or anxiety. Then, as the clock struck midnight, a strange sound echoed from somewhere in the house. A soft rustle, as though something had shifted. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, listening for any further movement, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was nothing. Just the house settling. Nothing more. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The letter's warning loomed over me like a shadow, growing darker and more oppressive as the minutes ticked by. What would happen tomorrow? Was I supposed to make some life-changing decision? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But I had no choice but to wait. And wait I did, as the hours dragged on, the night stretching endlessly before me. Tomorrow would come soon enough. and with it, whatever Daniel had warned me about. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning came slowly, dragging itself into the room as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. I hadn't slept at all. My mind was too busy, too filled with the questions that the letter had raised, the feeling that something was about to happen. I looked at the clock, 6:30. It was still early, but the anticipation felt overwhelming. My pulse quickened, and I glanced nervously at the letter on the nightstand. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than some elaborate prank, but deep down, I knew something was different. Something felt off. I shook my head and pushed myself out of bed, trying to focus on the mundane actions of starting the day. I showered, dressed, made coffee, all while my mind raced with possibilities. What did Daniel mean by a choice? What could he have been referring to? I had no way of knowing. As I sipped my coffee, I glanced at the clock again, 6:55. 5 minutes. 5 minutes until the time he had mentioned. I set the mug down, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the ticking clock seemed to grow louder, as if mocking me, reminding me of how little control I had. Was I supposed to do something? Was I supposed to be somewhere? Or was this all just some cruel trick of my mind? Suddenly, I heard it. A soft rustling sound from somewhere in the house, just like last night. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The noise wasn't coming from the usual creaks of the house settling. It was deliberate, almost as though something, or someone, was moving. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. The room felt colder, the air heavier. My eyes darted toward the door. Was someone in the house? My heart raced, my mind running through possibilities, but none of them made any sense. I lived alone. There was no one else here. But the sound persisted, faint but unmistakable. I walked toward the hallway, my footsteps cautious, every sound magnified in the eerie silence. The house felt different. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick with tension. My skin prickled with unease. As I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped and listened. The house was quiet once again, too quiet. I glanced back toward my bedroom, where the letter still lay untouched, a constant reminder of the ominous message it held. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do something. Steeling myself, I descended the stairs slowly. The sound of my own footsteps seemed deafening, echoing in the stillness. As I reached the bottom, I stopped, scanning the darkened living room. Everything was exactly where it should be, nothing out of place. But the air still felt wrong, like there was something lurking just beyond my sight. I turned the corner into the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. And then I saw it. On the floor, just in front of the door, was a piece of paper. It was crumpled, as if someone had hastily discarded it. I bent down to pick it up, my heart racing. The handwriting on the paper was not mine. It was unfamiliar, but the words, "You will not escape what is coming. The choice is already made." A chill ran through me as I read the words again. How was this possible? How could someone have written this? The letter, the strange noises, the paper that appeared out of nowhere, it was all too much. I stood up, the paper still clutched in my trembling hand. I felt like I was losing control of reality. I could hear the ticking of the clock again, louder now, as if the seconds were counting down to something inevitable. Suddenly, I heard a noise from behind me. A soft shuffling sound, as though someone was moving through the house. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was empty. But as I looked back toward the door, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a pair of shoes positioned just inside the threshold, as if someone had been standing there recently. They were old, worn, and clearly not mine. I felt a surge of panic. Was someone watching me? Someone who knew what was about to happen. The clock on the wall read 7 o'clock. The feeling of dread tightened around my chest. I had no idea what was coming, but everything in my body screamed that it was too late to stop it now. And then, without warning, the phone rang. I jumped, startled by the sudden noise. The sound felt like a jolt, snapping me back into the present. My hands shook as I picked up the receiver, my breath shallow. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end, the silence stretching for what felt like an eternity. Then, a voice broke the stillness. A voice that I knew all too well. It's Daniel. You have to listen to me. My heart stopped. How was this possible? How was he? The voice continued, but it wasn't the voice I remembered. It was distorted, almost as if it was coming from somewhere far away, through a veil of static. You've seen the signs. You've read the letter. There's no going back now. They're already here. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind struggling to process what was happening. I wanted to hang up, to escape, but my body wouldn't move. You have to make the right choice. The wrong one will cost you everything. The line went dead. I stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed against my ear. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. Was it real? Had it been him, or was it something else? I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the wall in front of me, my mind racing. The letter. The noises. The shoes. Daniel's voice. Everything was connected, but I couldn't understand how. Or why. What was I supposed to do now? I dropped the phone, the receiver slipping from my hand to the floor with a soft clatter. My mind was spinning, racing in 1,000 directions. The call had been too real, too vivid to ignore, but the more I tried to make sense of it, the more everything blurred into a terrifying mess of confusion and fear. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting from one object to another, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No answers, only questions. The clock ticked on, relentless, the seconds passing with a quiet but insistent rhythm, as if mocking my inability to understand. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to calm myself. The letter. The shoes. The phone call. All of it felt too much, too unnatural, like I was caught in the middle of some twisted dream. I walked to the window and looked out. The street outside was quiet, as it always was this early in the morning. Cars passed by, people walked their dogs, the world continued on as if nothing was wrong. But I felt like I was on the edge of something, standing at the precipice, and I didn't know whether to jump or turn away. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, startled by the sudden interruption. I pulled it out quickly, hoping to find some sort of reassurance, some logical explanation. But there was nothing. It was a text message from an unknown number. It's too late to change it now. You have already made your choice. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. The words were exactly like the ones from the letter, but this time they felt different, colder, more direct. It was like someone, or something, was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. and I didn't know if I had the strength to do anything. My thoughts were interrupted by another noise, faint but distinct. A soft scratching sound, like nails dragging across the floor. It came from behind me. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. The living room was empty, just like it had been when I first walked in. But the air felt thicker now, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The scratching continued, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the floor anymore, it was coming from upstairs. The stairs. The place where I had felt the strange presence the night before. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I took a deep breath, my legs shaky beneath me, but I forced myself to move toward the stairs. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to leave, to run, but my body was already moving. I couldn't stop now. With each step, the sound grew louder. It was almost rhythmic now, like a slow, deliberate crawl. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, straining my ears to listen. The house was eerily quiet again, the scratching sound gone. But I knew something was wrong. It was too silent. I walked down the hallway, each footstep echoing in the stillness. The door to the guest bedroom was cracked open, just slightly. It hadn't been opened before. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway. It was empty, but there was something about the room that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it. On the floor, just by the bed, was a small object, a piece of paper. It was crumpled, the edges frayed, as if it had been discarded in haste. I bent down, my hands trembling, and picked it up. They are already here. It is too late to stop them. You cannot hide from what is coming. The same message, the same warning. The words sent a jolt of panic through me. How had it gotten here? Was someone in the house? Or was I simply losing my mind? I turned the paper over, desperate for some clue, some explanation. And that's when I saw it. A single, small drawing. It was crude, sketched quickly with a pencil. A figure, shadowed and indistinct, but unmistakably human. And beneath it, written in small, tight handwriting, "Do not trust what you see." The blood drained from my face. The words were so simple, but the weight of them, of everything that had happened, was crushing. I stumbled back, dropping the paper to the floor. My breath came in shallow gasps. The walls seemed to close in on me, the room spinning. The noise, the letters, the warning. It was all connected. But I couldn't see how. Suddenly, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. It was unmistakable, the sound of someone walking toward the door. I froze, paralyzed with fear, my eyes locked on the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then they stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. But nothing came. No more footsteps. No more sounds. I slowly turned toward the door, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I reached for the handle, my fingers cold, and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stepped into the hallway, my breath coming in uneven gasps. The feeling of being watched, of something just beyond my reach, intensified. My senses were heightened, my mind racing, but everything was still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper, but then it grew louder. "You've made your choice." I spun around, but there was no one in sight. "It's too late." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a chilling echo that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. I stumbled backward, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense anymore. And then, everything went dark. I awoke with a start, gasping for air. My chest heaved as if I had been running, but my body was still. I was back in my living room, sitting on the floor with my head resting against the wall. For a moment, I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. My mind struggled to piece together what had happened. The footsteps, the voice, the dark room. It all felt like a nightmare, too vivid, too real to be a dream. But the room was still, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to steady myself. The message, the warning, was still fresh in my mind. "You've made your choice." But what did it mean? What choice? And what was I supposed to do now? My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was going on. But there was nothing. Just the same familiar objects, the same quiet space. I reached for my phone again, almost desperately, hoping for something to give me a clue. There was a text message waiting for me. This time, it was from an unknown number, just like before. "Look at your reflection. You'll see what they want." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I had already seen enough. The mirror. The reflection. Everything I had ignored, everything I had tried to push aside, was coming back to me, crashing in waves I couldn't stop. I stood up unsteadily, my legs weak beneath me. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I had to find some way to make sense of this nightmare. I walked toward the hallway, my mind racing with questions, and stopped in front of the mirror that hung at the end. The same mirror I had walked by 1,000 times, the same one I had never given much thought to. But now, it felt different. It felt wrong. I took a deep breath and stared at my reflection. My face looked pale, drawn, eyes wide with panic. I looked frightened. I didn't know what I expected to see, but something deep inside me was telling me that the reflection wasn't right, that it was hiding something. I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the glass. But as soon as my hand made contact, I froze. The reflection moved. I blinked, and the figure in the mirror, the one that was supposed to be me, shifted. It didn't mimic my movements. It was separate, a shadowy version of me that didn't belong. It smiled, a wide, unnerving grin that made my blood run cold. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What was happening? What was I seeing? The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, its fingers bending unnaturally, almost as if trying to break free. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the figure didn't stop. It kept reaching, its eyes locked onto mine, its grin growing wider. And then it spoke. "It's too late. There's no turning back now." The words were spoken softly, almost sweetly, but they sent a wave of terror through me. This wasn't me. This wasn't real. Or was it? The reflection's hand slammed against the glass, sending a jolt of panic through me. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. I fell to the floor, my back hitting the cold wood. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare that felt all too real. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in like they were alive, suffocating me. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was a doorway, a portal to something dark and unknown. You have already chosen. The end is near. The voice again, this time closer, echoing in my mind. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Was it the reflection? Or was it something else? I looked up at the mirror one last time. The figure was still there, staring back at me with those eyes, cold, calculating, waiting. I turned away, scrambling to my feet. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. I rushed to the door, desperate for air, for space, for some sense of reality. But as I grabbed the handle, I froze. There, in the corner of the hallway, standing just out of sight, was a figure. It was me. I could see the outline of my body, the same clothes I had been wearing all night, but this version of me didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the truth. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. Something that had been waiting. And now it was here. You made your choice, the voice whispered again, this time louder, clearer. I could hear footsteps behind me, growing closer, the air growing heavier with each passing second. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't run. My legs were frozen. The figure in the hallway was slowly stepping toward me, its gaze never leaving mine. You can't escape. It took another step forward, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. The walls, the floor, the air, they were all merging into one suffocating force, trapping me in the space I had always thought of as safe. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the room went silent. Completely still. No footsteps. No voices. No reflections. Just silence. I dared to open my eyes, and when I did, I saw that the hallway was empty. The figure was gone. The mirror was once again just a mirror. Everything was normal. But the fear, the lingering feeling that something was terribly wrong, never left. It was only then that I realized I hadn't made a choice at all. It wasn't up to me. And whatever had come for me, whatever I had invited into my life, wasn't going to stop. It was just beginning. The silence was suffocating. It hung in the air, heavy and thick, as if the very house itself was holding its breath. I stood frozen, my mind still struggling to make sense of everything that had just happened. But as the seconds dragged on, I felt something else, something cold, something deep and ancient. It was a presence. A weight pressing down on me from all sides. I wasn't alone anymore, and I knew it wasn't just the figure in the mirror or the one in the hallway. There was something else, something far worse, and it was watching me. The room was the same, but it felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with an unseen force. I took a cautious step forward, my body trembling, and reached for the door handle. My hand brushed against it, and a sudden, sharp pain shot through my fingers. I recoiled, gasping. I looked down. Blood. My own blood was dripping from my fingers, staining the floor beneath me. I hadn't been cut, hadn't touched anything sharp. But the blood, it was real. I could feel it. I staggered backward, panic rising in my chest. What was happening? Why was this happening? The room began to shift again. The walls weren't just pulsing, they were warping, twisting as if they had a life of their own. The edges seemed to bend and stretch, pulling and pushing in unnatural ways. The house was changing. It was becoming something else, something I didn't recognize. I turned my head sharply to the window, but the outside world was gone. There was no sky, no streets, no houses. Only a void, a dark emptiness that stretched on forever. I could feel it pulling at me, as if it wanted to swallow me whole. And then the voice came again, the same voice from before. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, clear, almost amused. You are not meant to be here. I whipped my head around, searching the room for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. No figure. No shadow. Just me. Alone. But then, the mirror. I turned toward it again, dread filling me as I stepped closer. The reflection was different this time. No longer the distorted figure of myself, no longer the shadowy version with the wide grin. No, this time, the reflection was showing something far more terrifying. It showed me lying on the floor, eyes wide open, unblinking. My body was still. Lifeless. Dead. A scream rose in my throat, but it wouldn't come out. My lips trembled, but my voice was trapped inside. And then, as I watched in horror, the reflection moved. My body in the mirror stood up, stiffly, and turned to face me. But it wasn't me anymore. The figure that mirrored my every move now wore a twisted expression, one that didn't belong to me. It was smiling. A grin that stretched far too wide, that exposed too many teeth, and it wasn't mine. It was something else. Something ombre. You made your choice, the voice echoed again, louder this time, as the reflection in the mirror reached toward me. I backed away in terror, stumbling over my own feet. My legs shook violently, and I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was this the real world, or was I trapped in some nightmare? The reflection's hand reached through the glass, passing through the surface like it was made of water, and I screamed. I turned and ran for the door. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls were closing in on me, and I felt like I was suffocating, like the house itself was alive and trying to crush me. But as I reached for the door again, something grabbed me from behind. Cold, clammy fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see it. I couldn't. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I fought against the invisible grip, but it was too strong. It dragged me back toward the mirror, pulling me closer and closer to the dark reflection that waited for me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't fight anymore, I heard a sound. A familiar sound. The sound of footsteps. My footsteps. I looked down at the floor, and there, imprinted in the dust and grime, were the same barefoot prints I had seen earlier. But they weren't just a memory anymore. They were real. The prints were right there, beneath me, leading toward the mirror. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning, but there was one thing I understood. The choice I had made, or hadn't made, had led me here. I couldn't escape it. And then I felt it, a sharp, piercing pain in my chest. I gasped, looking down at the blood, at the dark stains spreading across my shirt. The mirror's reflection was moving closer, and I could feel it, too. The thing behind me. The thing I had invited in. You were the one who called me. And with that final whisper, the world around me collapsed. The darkness swallowed everything. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.